The wind coming off the Atlantic was thick with salt, and the smell of brine settled heavy over the shore. The lighthouse stood tall at the edge of the Maine coast, a stark white column against the gray sky, its rotating beacon slicing methodically through the late afternoon fog. I arrived at Whistler's Point in early October, thinking a few weeks of solitude would help me finish the manuscript I'd been dragging my feet on for months. My friend Kyle, a restoration contractor, had suggested I use the old keeper's house next to the Whistler Light, a 19th century structure he and his team had just finished restoring. "It's not on any maps anymore," he said. "Coast Guard decommissioned it in the 60s. Town owns it now. Real quiet. Just you, the ocean, and maybe a ghost or two." He laughed when he said that, but Kyle had always had a strange sense of humor. The house had no internet, no TV, and spotty cell reception. That was the point. I wanted to isolate myself, write, sleep, eat, repeat. The place looked solid from the outside, a white clapboard two-story with a steep roof and narrow windows. The lighthouse loomed just 20 yards away, connected by an old brick path lined with overgrown seagrass and moss-covered rocks. The entire property was fenced off by rusting iron bars and a locked gate, though Kyle had given me a spare key. Inside, the house was furnished modestly: an old couch, a battered oak desk, and a small kitchen that still smelled faintly of kerosene despite the updated appliances. Upstairs were 2 bedrooms, though I only used the one with the view of the lighthouse. It was drafty and creaked when I walked, but I told myself that added charm. The first night passed quietly. I stayed up late writing, the rhythm of the waves below my window oddly comforting. Around midnight, I thought I heard a faint knocking, but figured it was the shutters blowing in the wind. When I checked, they were closed and latched. Still, the sound continued for a few minutes before fading away. By the third night, I was getting into a groove. I'd wake around 7, make a pot of strong black coffee, and write until my fingers cramped. The only interruptions were the occasional gull crying overhead or the distant sound of a ship's horn. I noticed the lighthouse's rotating beacons still worked, even though the tower hadn't been manned in decades. I assumed the town kept it running for nostalgia or as a warning marker. The light clicked on at dusk, circled slowly, then shut off at dawn. Mechanical and reliable. On the 5th night, I woke up to footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps on the floor below me. I sat up, heart thudding, listening. The sound stopped. Then it came again. 1 step. Another. And then nothing. I waited a few minutes before grabbing the baseball bat I kept near my bed. The stairs creaked under my feet as I crept down in the dark, every board groaning louder than I remembered. The living room was empty. The door was locked. Windows too. I even checked the closets and under the sink. Nothing. I told myself I was imagining things, my brain playing tricks on me. I'd been isolated for days. Maybe I was just jumpy. That explanation worked until the 7th night. It was cold, and the wind howled through the cracks in the walls. I had fallen asleep early, exhausted after rewriting an entire chapter. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke to a faint sound, almost like humming. It was coming from the direction of the lighthouse. I went to the window and looked out. The light was still rotating slowly, slicing through the fog. But beneath the beam near the base of the tower was a dark figure. I couldn't make out details, just a tall, still shape, unmoving even as the wind whipped around it. I watched for 10 minutes. It didn't move. Not once. Then the humming stopped, and when the beacon passed over the base again, the figure was gone. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning I walked to the lighthouse. I wanted to believe it had been a trick of the light, a shadow from a rock or bush. But when I got closer, I saw something that chilled me. Footprints. In the wet moss and earth surrounding the base of the lighthouse, leading around the perimeter, were boot prints. Large, deep, fresh. But there was only one set. No prints leading toward the tower. No prints leading away. Just a perfect circle around it, like someone had been pacing or keeping watch. That night, I locked every door and window. I moved the desk in front of the front door. I slept with the bat in bed with me, heart pounding at every creak of the floorboards. Around 2 a.m., I woke to knocking. Not loud, just soft, rhythmic tapping. At first, I thought it was the shutters again, but it wasn't. The knocking was coming from inside the house, downstairs. I sat frozen, the blanket pulled up to my chin like a child hiding from monsters. The knocking stopped, then started again, closer this time. At the base of the stairs, I heard a single step on the staircase, then another. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I couldn't. And then it stopped. When daylight finally came, I packed a bag and drove into town. I needed a break, some normalcy, a diner, people, coffee that didn't taste like salt. I didn't tell anyone what had happened, not even Kyle. I was too afraid they'd think I was losing it. I stayed in a motel that night, slept 8 straight hours, dreamless. When I returned the next day, everything seemed normal. The house felt less ominous. Sunlight helped. I started writing again, determined to ignore whatever had happened. Ghosts didn't exist. The house was old, drafty. Old places made sounds. But that night, I made a mistake. I went into the lighthouse. I had found the key in a drawer in the house, attached to a brass tag that read Tower. Curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to see inside just once. It was a short walk, and the door creaked open with a reluctant groan. Inside, it smelled of rust and seawater. The staircase spiraled upward, narrow and steep. I climbed slowly, flashlight in hand. Every step echoed. Dust clung to the walls and cobwebs brushed my face. At the top, the room housing the light was small, circular, with thick glass windows that were fogged from the sea mist. What caught my eye wasn't the mechanism or the outdated equipment. It was the small wooden chair in the corner. Someone had been sitting there. Recently. The dust was disturbed and the seat was clean. On the floor next to it, a rusted oil lantern, long unused. I bent to examine it and saw, carved into the wood of the chair's backrest, the words, "He never left." The hair on my arms stood straight up. I turned and fled down the stairs, tripping once, almost falling. When I got outside, I slammed the door shut and threw the key into the sea. That night, the footsteps came again. This time, they didn't stop at the top of the stairs. I heard the bedroom door creak open, then the sound of boots on the wooden floor, slow and heavy. I sat up, gripping the bat, and stared into the dark. Nothing. But I could feel it. Someone was there, watching. I didn't sleep at all. The following morning, I called Kyle and told him I was leaving early. I made up an excuse about an emergency back home. He didn't question it. "You didn't see anything weird, did you?" he asked, half laughing. "That place has a weird vibe. My crew said they heard things, but I figured it was just nerves." I didn't answer. I packed everything and left by noon. A few weeks later, I did some digging. The last lighthouse keeper at Whistler's Point was a man named Edgar Thorne. Served from 1923 until 1958 when he was found dead at the base of the stairs inside the tower. Heart attack, the report said, but some articles suggested he had gone mad, claimed to see people in the water at night, pacing the beach, calling his name. Some said he refused to leave his post even after the tower was officially shut down, that he stayed up there, night after night, watching, waiting. A local historian I found through a library blog told me something I've never been able to forget. They say his spirit's still up there, watching the sea, keeping the light going. He believed it was his duty, said the ships would crash without him. He swore he'd never leave, and I guess he didn't. I never went back to Whistler's Point, but sometimes when I'm driving at night and the fog rolls in thick over the highway, I think about that rotating beam of light and the man who never left it behind. Story the end. It was the fall of 1993 when I took a temporary maintenance job at Fairport Harbor Lighthouse in Ohio. I was 26, just out of work from a warehouse in Cleveland that had shut down abruptly. The lighthouse hadn't been functional as a navigation aid since the late 1920s. It had been converted into a museum decades earlier. But the township still needed someone to do some renovations and overnight security while they installed new exhibits. The pay wasn't great, but they offered lodging in the lighthouse keeper's quarters, which seemed charming at the time. I was alone, and the solitude appealed to me. The lighthouse sat on the southern shore of Lake Erie, near the mouth of the Grand River. During the day, the lake could look endless, like a rolling ocean under gray skies. At night, it felt as though the water reached out to swallow the land whole. The head of the Historical Society, a kindly but terse woman named Gloria, gave me a walkthrough on my first day. She handed me a heavy ring of keys and rattled off what each opened, warning me not to misplace them. She told me to make sure the doors were locked by 5 p.m. and not to let any teenagers in after hours. Apparently, local kids like to sneak in for dares, and one had broken his leg a few years prior trying to climb the spiral staircase after hours. As she was leaving, Gloria paused at the base of the tower. "Don't let yourself get turned around in here," she said with a dry smile. "Old places have a way of shifting when no one's looking." I thought she was just being quaint. The first few nights were peaceful. I'd finish my maintenance work by late afternoon and then settle in with a book or walk along the lake before sunset. The place creaked constantly, but I chalked that up to its age and the wind off the lake. There was an odd smell, salt, mildew, and something faintly metallic, but nothing I couldn't get used to. On the fourth night, I was sitting in the living quarters reading a Tom Clancy novel when I heard footsteps on the spiral staircase. The tower was off limits to guests after hours and should have been locked tight. I set the book down and called out, but there was no answer. The steps continued, slow, deliberate. I grabbed the flashlight and went to check. The staircase wound up around the inside of the tower in a tight coil. My boots echoed as I stepped onto the iron treads. I paused to listen. The footsteps had stopped. I reached the top of the tower. The lantern room was empty, just a dusty Fresnel lens and the windows looking out over the lake. I turned in a circle. No one was there. When I came back down, I found the front door slightly ajar. I locked it again, feeling a prickle down the back of my neck. Maybe some kids had snuck in earlier and I hadn't noticed. Still, something about the way those footsteps echoed, measured, unhurried, didn't sit right. The next morning, I found a single wet footprint in the living room. It looked bare, narrow at the heel and wide at the toes. Just one. I checked every room. The floorboards creaked, as always, but there was no sign anyone had been inside. I told Gloria about it when she stopped by that afternoon with supplies. She looked at me a bit too long before saying, "Probably a raccoon or something." But raccoons don't leave bare footprints. They don't climb iron staircases. That night, I couldn't sleep. The lake was louder than usual. The waves crashed like distant explosions, and the wind howled around the tower. I lay awake in the small bed in the keeper's room, watching the ceiling. Around 3 a.m., I heard whispering. Not words I could make out, just the low hiss of breath and syllables. I sat up, heart pounding, and scanned the dark. The whispers seemed to come from the tower itself. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway. It was freezing, even though the heater was still running. The whispering stopped the second I turned on the light. After that night, the activity escalated. Objects moved. I'd leave my tools in the entry hall and find them later stacked neatly in the kitchen. Lights would flicker even though I'd replaced every bulb. The air grew thick at night, heavy like a thunderstorm was about to break, but no storms came. I started researching the lighthouse during my off hours. Buried in an old newspaper clipping from 1911 was a story about a keeper named Simon Hale. He had worked the lighthouse alone during a bitter winter and reportedly threw himself into the lake one night after claiming to see the drowned ones walking on shore. His body was never recovered. Other stories followed. A woman in the 1940s claimed her son had disappeared while playing near the base of the lighthouse. A few years after that, a couple walking their dog found an empty baby carriage inside the main doors. No sign of a baby, no one nearby. I tried to dismiss it. Old places attract rumors. But the events in the lighthouse continued. The most terrifying came on my 12th night. The fog was dense that evening, so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet out the windows. The foghorns from the lake groaned every few minutes, deep and mournful. I was checking the tower again, flashlight in hand, when I saw movement at the top. A figure, barefoot, thin, and soaked from head to toe, was staring out one of the narrow windows. Its clothes clung like wet rags to a body that looked impossibly pale. It didn't turn to look at me. I raised the flashlight and shined it toward the figure. Nothing was there. I descended the stairs 2 at a time and locked the door to the tower behind me. My hands shook uncontrollably. I went back to the living quarters and packed a bag. I didn't sleep. I sat on the couch with the flashlight in one hand and my grandfather's old hunting knife in the other, even though I knew neither would help. Just before dawn, I heard the footsteps again. Slow, wet, coming down the stairs. But this time, they didn't stop at the landing. They continued onto the hardwood floors of the hallway. Closer. I could hear the droplets hitting the wood. I waited, holding my breath, and then they stopped. I raised the flashlight and aimed it at the hallway. No one was there, but the floor was soaked in a trail of water, as if someone had just walked through with lake water dripping from their body. I quit the next morning. I told Gloria I was feeling sick and needed to leave town. She didn't press for details. She just looked at me and nodded like she knew. 2 weeks later, I got a package in the mail. No return address. Inside was a photo, an old black and white of a lighthouse keeper standing on the tower's balcony. He looked exactly like the figure I'd seen. On the back of the photo was written in faded ink, "Simon, Simon," before the lake took him. I burned the photo. I've never returned to Fairport Harbor, but I still see that figure sometimes, in my dreams mostly. Standing still at the top of a tower, watching the shore, water running off his fingertips, waiting. Story the end. It started when I took a seasonal job with the National Park Service in Maine. I had recently left a construction gig in Vermont that had dried up with the coming cold, and I was in that strange place of needing work, any work. A job listing posted at a gas station outside Portland caught my eye. Caretaker needed, Tibbetts Rock Lighthouse. It was handwritten, pinned up with a tack. I took a photo of it and called the number from the parking lot. The woman who answered, Cheryl, told me the position was for 6 weeks, mostly maintenance, cleaning, checking for weather damage, keeping generators running. The lighthouse had been automated decades ago, but the Park Service still had someone check on it in person during the winter, mostly due to vandals and storms. I didn't ask why the job was still posted on a corkboard in a gas station and not on some federal hiring website. I needed cash and shelter. I agreed before even hearing the full pay. Cheryl met me in town and gave me the keys, radio, and instructions. Tibbetts Rock Lighthouse sat about a mile off the coast on a small rocky outcrop barely wide enough to host the lighthouse and an adjacent keeper's house. It was reachable by boat in good weather or by helicopter when it wasn't. She explained I'd have a small boat and an emergency flare gun. Food and fuel would be dropped off weekly by boat, weather permitting. It sounded straightforward, almost peaceful. I'd always liked being alone, and the idea of spending December in a lighthouse sounded romantic in a weird way. I could work on my writing, breathe fresh air, and get paid for it. Cheryl drove me to the dock where an old fisherman named Carl waited with a weather-beaten skiff and a thermos of coffee. He barely looked at me as we loaded my gear. The ride was quiet. The wind was low that day, and the water was calm, but I could already see how fast conditions could turn. The lighthouse came into view slowly, the gray tower rising like a stone finger from the sea. Next to it stood a squat, 2-story house with storm shutters pulled closed on all the windows. As we approached the dock, Carl slowed the engine. "You sure you're going to be all right out here alone?" he asked without meeting my eyes. "I think so," I said, forcing a grin. "I like the quiet." He gave me a long look and nodded, almost disappointed. "Radio if something happens," he said. "And light the flare if you need out. Don't wait." The moment his skiff turned back toward shore, I felt the silence swell. There were no trees here, no animals, just wind, waves, and gulls. I unloaded my bags and went straight to the keeper's house. It smelled of mildew and old wood. Inside was sparse, just a bed, stove, sink, and a kerosene heater. The generator rumbled outside. I turned on the light and was relieved when it worked. That night, I read some logs left in a drawer. They dated back to the 1940s, when keepers still lived here year-round. Most were mundane, weather reports, maintenance notes, but one entry from 1949 stuck with me. The handwriting was different than the others, scrawled and shaky. "Heard knocking again last night, after the fog rolled in. Thought it was the wind, but it was too steady. From inside the tower, checked, but nothing there. 3rd time this week, not sleeping well." I laughed it off and went to bed, tired from the boat ride and moving boxes. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a soft, rhythmic sound. It sounded like a rope slapping against a pole. I figured it was something outside and tried to fall back asleep, but then I noticed it wasn't changing with the wind. It was too even. Tap, tap, tap. I got up, threw on my jacket, and stepped outside. The wind had picked up, howling between the cracks in the rocks. I walked toward the tower, flashlight in hand. The sound stopped the second I touched the iron door. I went inside anyway. The spiral staircase wound upward like a rib cage. I climbed slowly, the beam from my flashlight flicking across the old brick walls. Nothing. Just wind moaning through the glass at the top. I exhaled sharply and went back down. As I shut the door to the tower, I thought I heard something behind me, like breathing or fabric rustling. I whipped around, but the room was empty. The next few days were uneventful. I swept floors, checked the tower light, cooked simple meals. On the fourth night, a dense fog rolled in just after sunset. It was so thick I couldn't see past the porch. The sea was silent, smothered by the vapor. I sat reading in the main room, a cup of coffee warming my hands when I heard the knock again. This time it was louder. Tap, tap, tap. 3 precise knocks. Then silence. Then again. Tap, tap, tap. I stood and turned off the lamp. The room went dark except for the faint red glow from the heater. The knocks came again, slower, like someone was waiting for me to answer. I opened the front door, heart pounding. Nothing. Just fog, dense as soup. I could barely see the outline of the tower 15 feet away. I shut the door and locked it. That night, I barely slept. 2 days later, Carl dropped off supplies. I didn't mention the knocks. I didn't want to sound like a city idiot, afraid of wind and fog. But before he left, he asked, "You seen her yet?" I frowned. "Who?" He shook his head. "Forget it. Just stories." "Wait, what stories?" He grunted and turned back to his boat. "Just old crap. Fishermen talk. You get bored out here. Your mind starts seeing things." The next few nights I tried to ignore the sounds, but it got worse. It wasn't just knocking. I heard footsteps above me in the tower when I knew no one was there. I heard a woman crying, low and distant, like it was being carried on the wind. Then one night I woke up to the sound of the front door creaking open. I jumped up, grabbed the flashlight, and ran to the front room. The door was wide open. Fog rolled into the house, clinging to the floor. The air was so cold my breath came out in plumes. I stood frozen, flashlight trembling in my hand. Then I saw her. A woman standing at the base of the lighthouse, her back to me. She wore a long, dark dress that flapped gently in the windless fog. Her hair was matted black, reaching down her back. She didn't move. She just stared up at the tower. I called out. She didn't turn. I stepped onto the porch. "Hey, you all right?" Nothing. Not even a flinch. I walked down the stone path toward her, flashlight beam aimed at her back. As I got closer, I realized she wasn't standing on the ground. She was hovering a few inches above it. I stopped cold. My mouth went dry. I backed up slowly toward the house. As I stepped onto the porch, I tripped on the edge of the plank and fell hard, flashlight bouncing from my hand. When I looked back up, she was gone. The fog thinned as I scrambled back inside and slammed the door. My chest heaved. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I checked around the lighthouse for footprints, debris, anything. But the rocky soil held no prints, and there was no sign anyone had been there. That night, I sat by the window with the flare gun in my lap. I told myself if I saw her again, I'd shoot it. But she didn't come back. Instead, something else happened. Just after 2 a.m., the tower light cut out. I checked the generator. It was running fine. I climbed the tower to check the lamp itself, and that's when I found the handprint. It was small, pressed against the inside of the glass. But what froze me was the fact that the print wasn't from a hand like mine. The fingers were long, almost inhumanly so, and the palm was smeared, as if the hand had pressed against the glass from inside, then slid down. I wiped it off, restored the light, and went down, repeating to myself that there had to be an explanation. Condensation. A prank. Something. But I stopped telling myself that when I found the logbook open on the kitchen table the next morning, on the same entry I'd read that first night. The ink was smeared now, like someone had dragged their finger across the words, and beside the scrawl was a new line, written in fresh ink. "She lives in the light." I stayed 3 more nights. I don't know why. Maybe part of me wanted to prove I wasn't afraid, or maybe I was too ashamed to call for a ride back early. But the fog kept coming, thicker each night. I never saw her again, but I heard her constantly. She whispered my name once, I'm sure of it, a breath in my ear just before I drifted off. When Carl came for me at the end of my assignment, he didn't say much, just helped me load my bags and gave me a cigarette. I lit it with shaking fingers. As we pulled away from the dock, I looked back. At the top of the lighthouse, behind the glass of the lantern room, I saw her again, standing, staring out at me, her face pale and blank, her eyes black as the ocean floor. I never took another remote job again. I moved inland, married, had a son. I told my wife I just wanted to be far from the water, and she never asked why. Last week, I got a letter from Cheryl. They found the old lighthouse logs stored in an archive facility during a cleanup. She thought I'd want to see them. Inside was a photo of the 1949 keeper, a man named Edward Sykes. Um, he'd gone missing one winter, never found. Scrawled on the back in pencil were the words, "She waited for him in the light." I threw the photo in the fire. But that night I still dreamed of her, in the tower, waiting. Story. The end. The job offer was simple enough. A caretaker position at the old Gray Cliff Lighthouse, located on a small island off the coast of Maine. It was a seasonal gig, lasting a month, with good pay for someone willing to endure isolation. I was between jobs and eager for the quiet, so I applied. When they called me a week later, the voice on the other end was clipped, but polite. "We need someone to keep the light operational and maintain the grounds. No visitors, no interruptions." The last caretaker left abruptly. "You'll have radio contact, but cell reception is spotty. Sound good?" I said yes. The boat ride to Graycliff was long but beautiful. Cold, salt air, a rising sun spilling gold over choppy waters, seagulls trailing behind. The island was smaller than I expected, maybe 5 acres, dominated by the 120-foot-tall lighthouse with its faded white paint and rusted metal spiral staircase visible through the windows. The keeper's cottage was modest, with creaky wooden floors and peeling wallpaper, but it was home for the next 30 days. On my first day, I learned the lighthouse had been automated decades ago. My main duties were cleaning the lens, checking the generator, and logging weather conditions every 4 hours. The island's sole other structures were a small shed for supplies and an old boat dock that looked more like a skeleton of its former self. The solitude was immediate. No other humans for miles, just gulls and the wind's howl. Nights were clear and cold. I slept to the sound of waves crashing against granite cliffs below, the beacon of the lighthouse sweeping rhythmically across the dark sea. Around the third night, something shifted. I was sitting on the porch with a book when I heard footsteps on the gravel path leading from the dock. Strange, since no one was scheduled to visit. I grabbed my flashlight and went down to check, but found nothing. The island was empty, except for me. That night, I awoke to the sound of the foghorn, low and mournful, echoing across the water. The thing was, the foghorn had been decommissioned years ago. The system was dismantled, replaced with an automated light and radio beacon. I stepped outside and saw the fog rolling in thick and fast. The horn sounded again, closer now, more urgent. Goosebumps prickled my skin. I called the mainland on the radio, but the line was dead. The next morning, I found muddy footprints circling the base of the lighthouse. No shoes I recognized, heavy, old-fashioned boots, like from another century. The prints led up the stairs and stopped at the lantern room's door. Curious, I climbed the spiraling staircase and peered inside the lantern room. It was empty, except for the immense Fresnel lens catching the dawn's light, scattering rainbows across the cracked walls. That evening, I noticed the light flickered unexpectedly. I tightened screws and checked the generator. Nothing wrong. But the flicker persisted, always at the same time, around 2:15 a.m. I began to find odd things around the island. Small piles of seaweed in patterns near the dock, a scrap of old yellowed paper caught in the window, the faint scent of pipe tobacco wafting through the air, even though I hadn't brought any. The island's history haunted me. Graycliff was built in 1886, guiding ships through treacherous waters. It had been staffed by a long line of keepers, some of whom had disappeared mysteriously. The most infamous was Thomas Whitaker, who vanished during a fierce storm in 1911. His body never recovered. One rainy night, I was awakened by a knock at the door. Thunder rumbled overhead, and the sea lashed at the rocks below. I opened it to find no one there, just the footprints, again those heavy boots pressed into the dirt, leading to the lighthouse. I called out, voice cracking, but only the wind answered. That night, the footsteps started inside the lighthouse. I heard the metal stairs creak under weight that wasn't mine. The door to the lantern room slammed shut. I was frozen, heart pounding. Then came the whispers, low murmurs in a language I didn't understand, curling around my ears like smoke. The temperature dropped, my breath fogged in the stale air. Desperate, I recorded the sounds on my phone. When I played it back in daylight, the whispers were gone, replaced by silence. On day 12, I was going through old logs in the keeper's cottage. The pages were brittle, ink faded. One entry stood out, dated October 1911, written by Whitaker himself. Storm approaching. Sea rising. I hear the men calling from below the waves. The light must hold. I cannot leave my post. That same night, I dreamed of Whitaker. He stood on the cliffs below, drenched in rain, eyes hollow but burning with resolve. He raised a lantern high, the flame flickering but unextinguished. I woke to a blast from the foghorn, long and mournful, then silence. In the days that followed, the phenomena escalated. Objects moved on their own. A chair toppled in the cottage, heavy boots left impressions on the wooden floor, footsteps echoed when no one was there. One night, the lighthouse beacon stopped spinning. I climbed the stairs and found the gears frozen. As I worked the mechanism free, I felt a cold hand grip my wrist. I whipped around, nothing, but the pressure lingered like a ghost's embrace. I began to suspect I was not alone. On day 18, I spotted a figure standing on the rocky shore below, silhouetted against the moonlight, a man in a weathered coat, staring out at the sea. When I shouted, he vanished. That night, the lighthouse light extinguished completely. The island was plunged into darkness, except for a faint glow from the lantern room window. I climbed up to investigate and found the door locked from the inside. I pounded on it until it creaked open. The room was empty, but wet footprints led from the doorway down the stairs and out onto the rocks. The next morning, I was found huddled on the dock, muttering about the ghost who guarded the light. When the relief crew arrived, I told them everything. They listened, polite but skeptical. They told me the lighthouse had been automated and unstaffed for decades. No one had set foot on the island in years, until me. But the next day, the official logs from the Coast Guard showed no record of my arrival. My name was missing from the caretaker roster. I packed up and left Greycliff immediately. On the boat back to the mainland, I saw the lighthouse in the distance, its beacon shining steady and true against the rising sun. I never got a call back for another job like that. Sometimes when the fog rolls in thick over my town, I swear I hear the faint moan of a foghorn and footsteps on old metal stairs. And I know someone is still keeping the light on. Story the end. The day I took the job at Devil's Head Lighthouse, I didn't expect much. I was a freelance writer, scraping together stories to pay rent, and when the posting showed up, temporary lighthouse keeper needed, remote Maine coast, summer position. I figured it would be a quiet place to work and think. The pay was better than most gigs I could find, and the isolation sounded appealing. Devil's Head was known locally mostly for its rugged beauty and turbulent waters, but not for anything sinister, at least not officially. The lighthouse sat perched on a rocky cliff facing the Atlantic, a classic white tower with red trim built in 1892. It was automated now, but the Coast Guard still maintained the keeper's quarters. The job was mostly maintenance checks, logging weather, and keeping the equipment running. 3 months seemed doable. I arrived mid-June, dragging my suitcase up the narrow path, the salty air stinging my lungs. The wind whipped against my jacket, and the fog was already rolling in thick off the ocean. The keeper's house was a 2-story clapboard with peeling paint, overlooking the churning sea below. It looked lonely. Inside, the house smelled of damp wood and old cigarettes. There were old photos on the walls, black and white pictures of previous keepers, stern faces with sunburned skin and weathered hats. I unpacked my few things and climbed the spiral stairs into the tower where the massive Fresnel lens stood. It glittered, catching the low light like the eye of a great beast watching over the coast. That first night, I sat on the porch with a thermos of coffee, watching the fog roll in like a white tide. The only sounds were the crashing waves and the distant calls of seabirds. The light from the tower swept lazily over the water, a beacon in the night. I felt peaceful. But that peace didn't last. The second night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard footsteps outside. Not the soft, scuttling kind that small animals make, but heavy, deliberate steps pacing just beyond the porch. I looked out, flashlight in hand, but the thick fog swallowed everything. "Hello?" I called, my voice cracking. No answer. I stepped outside, the gravel crunching beneath my boots, and swept the beam around. No one. Just the fog and the restless ocean. I told myself it was probably a deer or raccoon, but the steps had a rhythm, a pattern that didn't feel natural. The following morning, I found deep impressions in the gravel, a long, dragging footprint that looked old, worn, but no tracks leading to or from it. It was as if something had appeared, left its mark, and vanished. I shrugged it off. The place was old, the ground uneven. On the third night, things escalated. Around 1 a.m., I woke to the sound of the radio crackling on its own. The static whispered unintelligible words like voices tangled in a storm. I grabbed the handheld radio and keyed the mic, but no one responded. The static grew louder, then suddenly stopped. That's when I heard the voice. Clear, distant, but unmistakable. "Help me." It was a man's voice, strained and desperate. I stumbled to the window and peered out. The fog was thick, the light from the tower barely cutting through. There was a shape on the rocks below that silhouetted against the waves. I grabbed my coat and flashlight and ran down the path, heart pounding. But when I reached the rocky edge, the figure was gone. Only the sea and the wind remained. I thought maybe I was dreaming, or the loneliness was getting to me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences multiplied. I'd hear knocks on the door when no one was there, lights flickering in the tower, cold spots so sharp I could see my breath inside the house, and always footsteps in the gravel outside. One afternoon, while cleaning the lens room, I found an old journal wedged behind a loose floorboard. It belonged to a keeper named Thomas Hale, who served here in 1923. His entries told a grim story. He wrote about a shipwreck, a schooner called the Mary Ann, that sank in a violent storm near the point. The captain and crew were lost, their bodies never found. Hale described hearing their voices at night, their desperate cries for help. He spoke of strange lights in the fog, figures walking the cliffs, and an overwhelming sadness that filled the air. Hale ended his last entry abruptly with a note about a visitor, a man who came to the lighthouse claiming to be the captain of the Mary Ann, asking for shelter. The next day, Hale disappeared without a trace. I sat reading that journal late into the night, feeling a chill creep along my spine. The stories seemed to echo what I was experiencing. That night, the fog was thick enough to swallow the lighthouse itself. The wind howled like a banshee, rattling the windows and shaking the porch. At around 2 a.m., I woke to a soft tapping sound, like fingers drumming on glass. I opened my eyes to see a pale figure standing outside the window. He was drenched, clothes soaked and tattered, his eyes wide and pleading. I froze. "Help me," he whispered again, voice ragged, eyes searching. Before I could react, he vanished. The next morning I found footprints in the dew, bare footprints leading to the cliff edge and ending abruptly. I realized then I was dealing with something that wasn't human. The nights became worse. Shadows moved in corners where no light reached. Whispered voices filled the rooms. Objects moved on their own. I started sleeping with the lights on and the door locked. One evening, a storm blew in, fierce and unforgiving. The radio went dead. The light in the tower flickered and died. The fog wrapped around the lighthouse like a shroud. I climbed the tower stairs to check the lamp. As I reached the top, a figure blocked my way, a tall man in a soaked coat, his face gaunt and eyes hollow. "Captain," I whispered, recognizing him from the journal's description. He spoke in a voice like the wind through broken glass. "You must help us. We are lost." "Who?" I asked, voice trembling. "The crew of the Mary Ann. We are bound to these cliffs until justice is served." I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. He reached out a hand, cold as ice, and suddenly I was pulled into visions of stormy seas, of a ship breaking apart, of men drowning and pleading. Then I saw the captain's betrayal, how he had abandoned his crew to save himself, leaving them to die. The ghostly captain turned to me. "You must tell the truth. Set us free." When I came to, the storm had passed. The lamp was lit, burning bright as ever. The fog had lifted. I packed my things and left the next day, the weight of what I had seen pressing down on me. Back in town, I wrote the story of the Mary Ann and her crew, their tragedy, the betrayal, and their restless spirits trapped by lies. Months later, I heard that the lighthouse had been renovated, with a memorial erected near the cliffs. I never returned to Devil's Head, but sometimes, when the fog rolls in thick and the ocean sings its mournful song, I still hear a voice whisper on the wind, begging for justice. Story. The end. The day I arrived at the Old Harbor Lighthouse, I had no idea I was stepping into a place where time and reality twisted in ways I couldn't have imagined. I was 25, fresh out of college, with a degree in electrical engineering, and eager to take a summer job that would put my skills to the test while giving me some solitude. The Old Harbor Lighthouse sat on a small rocky promontory along the rugged Maine coastline, a few miles north of a sleepy town called Cedar Cove. It was a working lighthouse, automated but in need of regular maintenance, and that was why the Coast Guard hired seasonal technicians like me. The lighthouse itself was a classic structure, tall, cylindrical, white with red trim, standing roughly 80 feet tall. Attached was a small keeper's house, weather-beaten, paint-peeling, but solid. The setting was breathtaking, with jagged cliffs dropping into the churning Atlantic below, and the salty sea air thick with the cries of gulls and the endless murmur of waves. Yet, even on that first afternoon, I felt a heavy silence settled over the place. It was as if the lighthouse itself held its breath. My job was straightforward. Maintain the light's mechanics, keep the generators in check, monitor the foghorn, and ensure the communication lines stayed active. I was alone out here, with only the radio to connect me to the mainland. The Coast Guard checked in weekly, but otherwise, it was just me and the sea. The first week was uneventful. The automated beacon worked flawlessly, cycling on and off as designed. At night, the lighthouse cut through the darkness, a rotating beam sweeping across the waves like a silent guardian. I kept a journal, mostly technical notes about repairs and observations. The weather was variable, clear, misty, and occasionally stormy, but nothing out of the ordinary. That changed on the 8th night. I was sitting in the cramped kitchen of the keeper's house trying to fix a flickering light fixture when I heard it. A faint tapping at the door. At first, I thought it was the wind or perhaps a loose shutter banging, but the tapping persisted, deliberate and rhythmic, like someone knocking. I approached the door cautiously and peered through the small glass pane. Nothing. The rocky path leading from the lighthouse to the mainland was empty, washed in moonlight. The sea was calm, the only sounds the distant crash of waves and the steady pulse of the beacon above. Shrugging, I locked the door again and turned back inside, but then I heard it again, this time from behind me. Slow footsteps, heavy and deliberate, pacing across the wooden floor above. The keeper's house was a single story. There was no upstairs. My heart hammered. I told myself it was my imagination. Old houses creak and settle. But the footsteps didn't sound like the house settling. They were too deliberate, too consistent. Back and forth, back and forth. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, shining the beam up at the narrow balcony circling the lantern room at the top of the tower. The door there was locked tight, and no one should have been able to get up there. No other entrances existed to the upper part of the tower except from inside the house or the ladder on the exterior, which was rusted shut. The beam caught nothing but swirling mist and the glint of seawater. That night, I barely slept. Every creak and groan made me jump. At one point, I thought I saw a shadowy figure standing near the base of the lighthouse, but when I blinked, it was gone. I wrote in my journal, "Something's not right here." The next day, I inspected the tower thoroughly. The exterior ladder was rusted beyond use, the balcony door locked tight, no signs of forced entry anywhere. The only footprints I found were my own, sandy and wet from the damp air. That afternoon, I came across an old leather-bound logbook tucked away in a dusty cabinet in the kitchen. The entries dated back to the 1920s. They were written by various keepers, describing their shifts, the weather, occasional ship sightings, and sometimes more personal notes. One entry caught my eye. It was dated October 1927 and read, "Maureen has been restless again. She waits at the rocks by the cliffs each night. The fog won't lift when she is near. I tried talking to her today, but she did not respond. Her silence weighs heavy on the soul of this place." Maureen? I'd never heard that name before. Curious, I turned the pages and found more mentions, sporadic, but always linked to strange weather, like a fog that lingered, and an unshakable feeling of unease. That night, as the fog rolled in thick and fast, I heard humming. It was faint, melodic, almost like a lullaby coming from outside. I grabbed my coat and flashlight and stepped onto the rocky shore below the cliffs. The beam swept through the mist and stopped on a figure, a woman in a white dress, her hair tangled, standing still as the waves crashed against the rocks. I called out, but she vanished like smoke before I could get closer. I stumbled back to the lighthouse, heart pounding, breath ragged. I spent the next few days digging through local records in Cedar Cove. The town library was small but old, and the librarian was used to requests about the lighthouse. She showed me a faded newspaper clipping from 1927. Young woman missing near Old Harbor Lighthouse. Maureen Callahan disappears during fierce October storm. According to the article, Maureen Callahan was engaged to the lighthouse keeper, Thomas Blake. On a stormy night, she had gone to the cliffs, upset and distraught, and was never seen again. Her body was never found despite exhaustive searches. People whispered that her spirit still lingered, unable to leave the place where she had vanished. The next few nights were a blur. The humming returned, louder and more persistent. Footsteps echoed through the empty rooms. Shadows flickered just beyond my line of sight. The fog seemed to press against the windows, cold and damp. I started feeling watched, like someone was always there just behind me. One night, I awoke to the sound of sobbing. The lantern above was dark, its power cut. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed the spiral stairs to the lantern room. As I reached the top, I saw her, Maureen, her pale face lit by moonlight filtering through the glass. Her eyes were empty, black voids. She stood at the window, looking out over the sea. I wanted to speak, to ask her what she wanted, but no words came out. Instead, she raised a trembling hand and pointed toward the cliffs below. I followed her gesture and saw a small moss-covered iron railing, barely visible through the fog. It was broken, twisted as if bent by great force. The next day, I braved the slippery rocks and climbed down to the spot. Hidden beneath layers of seaweed and debris was a crude grave marker, a small, weathered stone slab with faintly carved letters. Maureen Callahan, 1903-1927. The stone was cracked, half-sunken, but unmistakably a grave. I felt a chill run down my spine. I returned to the lighthouse and cleared the marker with my own hands, placing a small bouquet of wildflowers I'd picked earlier. I spoke aloud, hoping to offer some peace. That night, the footsteps stopped, the humming faded away. The fog lifted, and for the first time in days, the beacon shone clear and bright. I finished my assignment at the lighthouse, feeling like I'd laid a restless spirit to rest. Years later, I sometimes think back to that summer, the isolation, the sea, and the woman who waited in the mist. The Old Harbor Lighthouse stands still, guiding ships and holding secrets. Somewhere out there in the shadows and fog, Maureen Callahan finally found peace. Story the end. The lighthouse sat on the edge of a jagged cliff overlooking the Atlantic, its whitewashed walls stained by decades of salt and wind. I first saw it on a cold November morning in 1994 when I took the seasonal job as a keeper's assistant. The official title was light maintenance technician, but in reality it was a solitary position on a remote stretch of Maine's coast, Old Cape Light, long, automated, but still requiring a human touch to handle the quirks of old equipment. I was 27, just out of the Navy with some technical training and a restless spirit. The Coast Guard station in the nearby town of Harborside hired me for the winter season to check on the light, run diagnostics, maintain the diesel generator, and ensure the foghorn stayed operable during stormy nights. The lighthouse itself was intimidating, towering about 80 feet, perched on slippery rocks slick with algae. The attached keeper's house was a modest 2-story structure, yellow paint peeling and windows clouded with salt spray. The locals told me it was haunted, but I brushed off those stories. I was a man of logic and machines, not superstition. The first week was peaceful enough. I settled into the rhythm of my duties, climbing the narrow iron staircase up to the lantern room to polish the glass, test the beacon, and check the mechanical systems. The nights were long and cold, the wind howling like a banshee through the rigging and cliffs. The fog rolled in thick, blanketing the coast and swallowing sound. On my 6th night, I noticed something strange. While performing a routine check on the foghorn controls, I heard soft footsteps outside. I stepped onto the porch and scanned the rocky shoreline with my flashlight. The beam caught nothing but the swirling fog and jagged boulders. The footsteps stopped. I shook my head and returned inside. That night, I was awakened by a faint tapping on the window beside my bed. I reached out to close the curtain and saw, just for a moment, the reflection of a pale woman standing on the rocky cliff beyond the lighthouse. She wore an old-fashioned white dress, her long hair tangled by the wind, and her eyes dark, hollow pits seemed to suck in the moonlight. When I blinked, she was gone. I tried to rationalize it as a trick of the fog and my tired eyes, but the unease lingered. Over the next few days, the sightings became more frequent. I found footprints in the dust on the porch, small and bare, leading from the cliff edge toward the lighthouse and disappearing at the threshold. Inside the house, objects shifted positions overnight. The smell of salt and something else, something musty and cold, permeated the air. I heard distant humming at odd hours, a sorrowful, wordless tune that chilled me to the bone. One evening, I explored the lighthouse basement and found an old, rusted trunk hidden behind the boiler. Inside were letters and photographs dating back nearly a century. One letter stood out from a lighthouse keeper named Henry Bennett, addressed to his wife Maureen. The letter spoke of Maureen's declining health and Henry's desperation as the storms battered the coast. The final sentence was a chilling plea. If I should go before you, please forgive me, but the sea has claimed too many. I pocketed the letter, but didn't read more that night. The next storm hit hard. Gale-force winds tore through the trees, and rain lashed the windows. The power flickered, and the backup generator groaned under strain. The foghorn blasted a mournful warning into the tempest. I was checking the lantern room's mechanism when I heard a whisper. Soft, pleading, a woman's voice calling my name. Help me. I spun around, heart pounding, but the room was empty. The fog outside was dense, the swirling mist pressing against the glass. Then, through the haze, I saw her again, Maureen, her face wet with tears, her mouth moving silently. I felt drawn to her as if her sorrow reached through time to touch me. Suddenly, the room grew ice cold, and the lamp's light dimmed, flickering like a dying candle. The next morning, I found a fresh set of footprints leading from the cliff edge to the lighthouse door, mingled with seaweed and sand. But the tide was high all night, and the rocks should have been submerged. Over the following days, I tried to contact the Coast Guard. The radio crackled but was filled with static and faint, broken whispers. I could swear I heard someone crying over the channel, but every time I keyed the mic, silence returned. One night, I awoke to the sound of crashing glass. I rushed to the window and saw the lantern room's glass panes shattered, shards scattered like stars on the rocks below. The beacon was dark. I climbed the tower steps, carefully navigating the broken glass. There she was, Maureen, standing where the light had once been. Her white dress was soaked and clinging, and her eyes were two dark holes, empty but full of despair. She reached out to me with trembling hands. "Find him," she whispered. "Find Henry. The sea took him, but he's not free." I was frozen, the weight of her grief overwhelming. Then the wind carried her away, and the storm's fury returned. In the days that followed, I scoured the keeper's logs stored in the house. Henry Bennett's entries grew darker near the end, descriptions of nightly storms, strange noises from the sea, and a creeping fear that something was watching from the depths. One entry mentioned a rescue attempt during a violent storm in 1923. Henry had ventured out onto the rocks to save a shipwrecked sailor, but the waves overwhelmed him. His body was never found. Maureen's spirit was trapped in grief, bound to the lighthouse by the loss of her husband. I knew what I had to do. On the final night of my stay, I prepared a small ceremony. I lit candles, placed the letter and a few wildflowers by the broken lantern window, and spoke aloud, asking Maureen to find peace and Henry to return to her. The wind dropped. The fog thinned. For the first time in weeks, the beacon shone brightly, its light cutting through the darkness. I never saw Maureen again. I left the lighthouse that morning, the sun breaking over the sea. Old Cape Light still stands, watching over the rugged coast, its beacon a silent guardian. But sometimes when the fog rolls in thick and the night is still, locals say you can hear a woman's sorrowful humming carried on the wind. Story the end. The wind was fierce that October when I first arrived at the East Point Lighthouse, perched on the jagged cliffs of Maine's rocky coast. It was a remote place, far from any town, and I was the new temporary keeper, hired to cover for the regular guy who was taking a month off for health reasons. I was a city man, having worked as a naval engineer in Norfolk before, but I was ready for the isolation. The job was simple enough: maintain the light keep the grounds clear, and log the weather every morning and evening. A straightforward gig that paid well enough, and most importantly, it promised quiet. The lighthouse itself was a towering brick structure, weather-beaten and proud, standing guard over the unforgiving Atlantic. Attached to it was a small two-story keeper's house, cozy enough for one, but lonely. The isolation struck me hard the first night, the relentless roar of the ocean crashing beneath like the gusts bending the trees like they were made of paper. I settled into the old wooden rocking chair on the porch with a flask of coffee, trying to convince myself the solitude was a gift, not a sentence. For the first few days, nothing unusual happened beyond the usual storms and the occasional seagull squawking overhead. I dutifully maintained the light, cleaned the lenses, checked the foghorn, and recorded everything in the logbook. I even took to exploring the cliffs during the daytime, marveling at the endless ocean and sharp, frothy waves. But the quiet started to crack on the fifth night. I was settling into bed when I heard it, a soft knock on the front door. I froze. The isolation of the place made every sound seem amplified, but that was impossible. The island was only accessible by boat, and none was scheduled to arrive that late. I told myself it must have been the wind or a tree branch hitting the door, but the knock repeated, twice more, slow and deliberate. I pulled on my jacket and went outside with the flashlight. The porch was empty. The door was locked tight, the windows shut and sealed. The only footprints were my own. The next morning, I found muddy prints on the porch floor leading up to the door. They were faint, but definitely human. I stared at them for a long time, as trying to rationalize. Perhaps a desperate fisherman had come ashore, or a trespasser seeking shelter. But the stormy sea and jagged rocks made access treacherous. The boat dock was on the opposite side of the island, far from the lighthouse. I mentioned it in my log, though it felt strange to admit. That afternoon, I climbed to the top of the tower to inspect the light. The sun was sinking behind dark clouds, casting a cold orange glow across the waves. As I turned the heavy lens to check its rotation, I caught a glimpse of movement in the corner of my eye, a shadow in the narrow glass corridor behind the light. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just the empty stairs spiraling down. I shook my head, muttering to myself that I was imagining things. That night, the knocking returned, louder and more insistent. It wasn't at the door this time, but the windows. I jumped from bed to the window and flashed the light outside, but saw nothing but the whipping trees and rain slanting sideways. I thought about calling the Coast Guard or the mainland, but the old radio in the keeper's house was patchy at best, and the storms interfered with the signal. Over the next several days, strange things multiplied. I woke up to find the kitchen table set with a cup of coffee, steaming faintly, and a plate of biscuits. I had no memory of making either. My eyes had been closed all night. The smell of salt and old tobacco smoke lingered in the air, as if someone else had been there, lingering. Sometimes I heard footsteps on the stairs when no one was there. Sometimes I would glance toward the window and see a figure standing on the cliffs, watching the sea, pale and still as a statue. One morning, I discovered a message scratched into the fogged-up glass of the bathroom window. "Don't leave." I stared at it until the glass was clear again, but the words stayed burned into my mind. I was starting to feel something watching me, a presence that wasn't human, or at least not alive anymore. On my 12th night, the storm hit its peak. The wind shrieked through the cracks in the walls, and waves crashed with the fury of 1,000 fists against the cliffs. The power flickered and died, plunging the keeper's house into darkness. I lit candles, but the light barely pushed back the oppressive blackness. I sat huddled in the corner of the main room, clutching my flashlight like a lifeline. Suddenly, the foghorn outside began to wail, not the mechanical, steady blast I expected, but a long, mournful moan that seemed to ripple with grief and warning. I ran to the window and looked out into the storm. There, standing at the edge of the cliffs, was a figure. A man, his clothes drenched and torn, his hair plastered to his face. He stood perfectly still, staring out at the sea as the waves threatened to swallow him whole. I grabbed the coat from the rack and rushed outside into the storm, trying to reach him, but as I approached, he vanished like mist. Back inside, I shivered uncontrollably and tried to steady my breathing. The next day, when the storm cleared, I explored the cliffs near where I had seen the figure. Half buried in the mud was an old wooden box. Inside, I found rusted maritime tools and a brittle, water-stained journal. The journal belonged to a man named Thomas Whitaker, the lighthouse keeper who had lived here nearly a century ago. His last entries were chilling. He wrote of a terrible night when a ship wrecked on the rocks below. He tried to signal for help with the foghorn, but the storm drowned out his warnings. The ship broke apart, and many souls were lost. The last line read, "I will watch and wait for them all so they never sail blind again." I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. Could the figure be Whitaker's ghost, still keeping vigil? That night I heard the footsteps again, but this time they were accompanied by soft singing. An old sea shanty, mournful and sweet, drifting through the halls. I followed the sound to the tower stairs, and halfway up, I saw him. Whitaker, or something like him. His eyes were sunken, his face gaunt but kind. He looked at me with a silent plea, then faded away. I never told anyone what I saw. I wasn't sure if I wanted to be believed or if I believed it myself. The last week was a blur of restless nights and strange dreams. I dreamed of waves swallowing ships, of faces pressed against glass, calling for help I couldn't give. On the final night, I sat in the lantern room, watching the beacon spin. The sea was calm, and the sky clear. I heard the footsteps once more and turned to see Whitaker standing behind me. He smiled softly. "Thank you," he said, voice barely a whisper, "for keeping the light burning." And then he was gone. When the ferry arrived the next morning, I packed my things in silence. I never went back. The lighthouse still stands, its beams slicing through fog and darkness, guarding the treacherous waters. And sometimes, on stormy nights, if you listen close, you can hear a faint shanty carried on the wind, a reminder that some watches never end. Story the end. The summer of 1992 was supposed to be the start of something new for me. A fresh job, a chance to prove I could handle responsibility, and a break from the noisy city life that had been wearing me down. I had just graduated with a degree in maritime history and preservation, and when the National Park Service posted an opening for a lighthouse caretaker on Monhegan Island, Maine, I jumped at it. Monhegan was small, remote, and almost entirely cut off from modern life. The lighthouse, built in the early 1800s, had been automated years before, but the Park Service wanted someone to live there part-time, maintaining the property, keeping logs, and assisting visitors during the summer months. I figured the quiet isolation would suit me just fine. The island itself was rocky and windswept, rising sharply from the Atlantic like some ancient sentinel. The lighthouse perched on a cliff overlooking the vast open ocean, its white tower stark against the blue sky. When I arrived by ferry in early June, I was the only one stepping off that morning. The town was sleepy. The few residents greeted me with polite nods but kept their distance. The caretaker's cottage was a modest two-story wooden house near the lighthouse, painted weather-beaten white. Inside, it smelled of salt and old wood. The furnishings were sparse, but there was a small stove, a collection of maritime charts, and an old brass lantern hanging on the wall. It was the perfect place to start fresh. My days settled into a routine. I woke early to climb the lighthouse steps, cleaning the lens and checking the weather instruments. Afternoons were spent tidying the grounds and exploring the island. Evenings, I recorded my observations in the logbook, then cooked simple meals by the stove. The first week passed without incident. I loved the solitude and the way the ocean seemed endless from the tower's top. The foghorn's mournful blasts echoed through the evening air, a sound both eerie and comforting. But on the 8th day, things changed. It was just after midnight when I first noticed something strange. I was lying in bed, the cottage quiet, except for the faint creak of the wind against the windows. Suddenly, I heard a soft tapping on the front door. I froze. No one lived nearby. The ferry wouldn't return until morning. Who could it be? I grabbed my flashlight and crept to the door, heart pounding. Outside, the porch was empty. The only movement was the swaying of the hanging lantern in the breeze. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to a branch or some bird. But then the tapping came again. This time, a slow, deliberate knock, 3 distinct raps. I backed away from the door, suddenly cold. The old wooden floorboards groaned beneath me as I moved toward the window. Outside, there was no one, only the faint outline of the lighthouse, its red light sweeping rhythmically across the dark waves. The next day, I told the island's general store owner about the knocking. He raised an eyebrow. "That place," he said, "has a long history. Some say the last keeper never left." I laughed it off, but the seed of doubt had been planted. That night, the knocking returned. This time, accompanied by whispers just outside the door. Low voices, indistinct but chilling. I sat awake, clutching my jacket, listening as the sounds faded into the wind. Over the next few days, more strange occurrences followed. Footsteps on the stairs when I was alone, cold spots that seemed to move through the rooms, and lights flickering in the lighthouse when the power was off. One afternoon, I climbed the tower and found fresh footprints in the dust on the top platform, size too small to be mine. I began to feel watched, especially at night. On the 12th day, I decided to confront whatever was there. I climbed the spiral staircase to the lantern room at midnight, carrying a flashlight and a small bell I had found in the keeper's logbook. I rang the bell 3 times, loud and clear. The air went still. Then the red light in the lantern flickered and died. A cold breeze swept past me, carrying a faint scent of salt and something else, something like old tobacco and pipe smoke. Then I heard it, a voice, clear and sorrowful, whispering in the dark. "Home." I stood frozen, the hair on my arms standing straight. Suddenly, a shadow passed over the glass panes. I turned quickly, but there was no one. For the rest of the night, the whispers continued, fragmented words, a soft sighing, and the gentle creaking of the lighthouse. The next morning, I searched the archives for any record of the last keeper. His name was Samuel Harper. He served from 1889 until 1910, when a violent storm battered the island. Harper was found dead at the foot of the cliff the next morning. No one knew if he had fallen or been swept away by the waves. Locals believed his spirit remained, bound to the lighthouse he had tended for decades. The stories matched what I had experienced. That night, I left a small candle by the window and whispered a quiet prayer. For the rest of my stay, the knocking ceased. The footsteps grew faint, and on the last night, as I climbed the lighthouse steps one final time, I felt a presence beside me, a calm, protective weight. When I looked out at the ocean, the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon, I knew I wasn't alone. I had shared the lighthouse with a guardian of the past, a keeper who still watched over the rocks and waves. When the ferry came the next morning, I left the island quietly, my heart heavy, but at peace. I never returned to Monhegan, but every now and then when the fog rolls in thick and the wind carries the scent of salt and smoke, I swear I hear the faint toll of a bell and the whispered voice of Samuel Harper, still calling out from the lighthouse. Story the end. The first time I saw the Beacon Point Lighthouse, it was a dull, gray afternoon in early November. The ocean was restless, waves crashing against the jagged rocks below the cliff, sending up salty sprays that caught in the wind. The lighthouse stood tall and lonely, its white paint chipped and peeling from years of bitter storms. I was fresh out of the Coast Guard and looking for work, and the job of lighthouse keeper at Beacon Point was the only thing that came up. A chance to get away from the noise of the mainland, to work alone, and keep the light burning for the fishermen and cargo ships navigating the treacherous coastline. The man who hired me was terse and matter-of-fact. He handed me a keyring, a clipboard with a checklist, and a few worn maps. "The light hasn't gone out in over a century," he said. "Keep it that way. You won't have much company. The fog can roll in fast and thick. Don't lose sight of the beacon, and don't let your guard down." His eyes flicked over me as if weighing something unspoken. I nodded and took the job. Beacon Point was as isolated as the map suggested. The only way to get there was by a narrow, winding road that snaked along the cliffs, where one misstep meant tumbling into the dark Atlantic below. The cottage next to the lighthouse was small but sturdy, with enough room for me and the essential equipment. A wood stove in the corner promised warmth during the cold nights, and the thick stone walls muffled the howling wind outside. The first week was quiet, almost eerily so. I woke before dawn, tended the light's machinery, cleaned the lens, and checked the batteries and generator. The foghorn was tested every 4 hours, its mournful wail cutting through the mist. I kept a journal, noting weather patterns and any anomalies. The locals from the nearby town had warned me about the place. Beacon Point isn't just a lighthouse, one old man told me in the pub. It's a marker for souls lost at sea and some that never left. I laughed it off. Ghost stories to keep tourists wary, I thought. But on my 8th night, things changed. I was sitting by the stove, reading the faded pages of a naval manual when I heard it, a soft tapping coming from the window. I looked up, expecting rain or wind, but the night outside was still, the sea calm beneath a low-hanging fog. The tapping came again, 3 distinct knocks. My heart quickened. I crossed the room and peered out, nothing but thick gray. No sign of life, no boats, no birds. I told myself it was just branches against the glass. I turned back inside, only to hear footsteps on the gravel outside. Heavy, slow steps coming closer. I grabbed the flashlight and opened the door. The beam swept the yard, but no one was there. Hello? My voice sounded hollow. Is someone there? Only silence answered. I shut the door and locked it, checking every window twice. The tapping stopped. That night, I barely slept. The next day, I found footprints in the mud outside the cottage, barefoot, large, and wet, leading toward the lighthouse. I followed them hesitantly, but they stopped at the foot of the tower stairs. No footprints on the metal steps. I brushed it off as some drunken local, though no one had any business out there at night. When I reported it, the regional supervisor sounded concerned but said to stay alert. This place has a history, he said. The following nights grew stranger. On the 10th night, the light in the lighthouse began to flicker just after midnight. The generator sputtered and died, plunging the tower into darkness except for the faint glow of the moon through the fog. I rushed outside to restart the generator, but when I reached the base of the lighthouse, I saw something I couldn't explain. On the balcony at the very top, silhouetted against the fog, was a figure. Tall, stoic, in old-fashioned clothes, water dripping from his coat. He stood perfectly still, staring out to sea. I blinked. When I looked again, he was gone. Shaking, I climbed the spiral stairs to the balcony. There was nothing there but the chill and the wind. No wet footprints. No sign of anyone. I started checking the lighthouse's history, digging through old newspapers and town records during the daylight hours. I found reports of a keeper named Samuel Hargrove who vanished during a storm in 1923. The story said Samuel was found days later, washed up on the rocks below the lighthouse, though no one knew how he disappeared in the first place. Some said he jumped. Others whispered darker things. One line stuck with me. The light went out for a single hour that night. I stared at my logbook. I had let the light falter for almost that exact amount of time on the 10th night. My stomach tightened. Was I somehow connected to him? Had the ghost of Samuel Hargrove been waiting for someone to keep the light burning? The knocking returned that night, louder and more insistent. Not at the cottage window this time, but at the door to the lighthouse. 3 knocks, then 3 again. I hesitated, heart pounding. Finally, I opened the door. Nothing but empty fog. But from the stairwell, I heard breathing. Heavy, labored, like someone climbing the stairs. I shone my flashlight up, but the beam cut through only mist. I stepped inside cautiously. At the landing halfway up, the air turned icy. I could see my breath, and then a shadow moved at the edge of the light. I called out, "Samuel?" The shadow didn't answer. I climbed the stairs, each step creaking underfoot. When I reached the top, the door to the light chamber was open despite my locking it earlier. The balcony was empty, but the cold was unbearable. Then a sudden gust slammed the door shut behind me. My flashlight flickered and died. I was plunged into darkness. The lighthouse light above had stopped rotating. Then I heard a voice, low, desperate, pleading. "Don't let it go out." The words echoed through the chamber. I fumbled for the emergency light pack on my belt. When the glow finally illuminated the room, I saw a figure in the corner. The same man I'd seen before. Samuel. He looked at me, eyes hollow and dark. I stepped back. He raised a hand and pointed out over the sea. I followed his gaze. Through the fog, a ship was visible. A small fishing vessel, struggling against the waves. Suddenly, the ship's light went out. Samuel's voice was louder now, urgent. "Light the beacon." I ran to the controls and managed to restart the generator. The lighthouse light flickered back to life, cutting a steady beam through the fog. The ship's lights returned. The radio crackled. "Beacon Point lights back," came a voice from the fishing vessel. Samuel smiled faintly, then faded away. I collapsed against the wall, shaking. I knew then that the ghost of Samuel Hargrove had been trapped, bound to the lighthouse, desperate to keep the light burning. After that night, the footsteps stopped, the knocking ceased. The foghorn's call returned to its steady rhythm. I finished my rotation and left Beacon Point, but I never forgot the weight of those nights. Somewhere between the sea and the sky, the past and the present, the lighthouse keeper's spirit remains, vigilant and restless. The ocean still claims its secrets, but the light never goes out. Story the end. It started with a job listing I found online, a government contract post to temporarily operate and maintain a decommissioned lighthouse on a small island off the coast of Maine. The ad was brief, but detailed enough to hook me. Caretaker needed, 1-month assignment, lighthouse is solar-powered, must be able to handle solitude, supplies provided, $5,000 compensation. I'd just finished my seasonal job as a groundskeeper at Acadia National Park and needed something to get me through the lull before winter hit. They called it Marblehead Light, even though it wasn't anywhere near the town of Marblehead. It sat on its own rocky islet, maybe 2 acres wide, with no other structures besides the squat white lighthouse, a generator shed, and an old boat dock that looked like it hadn't seen an upgrade since the 50s. It took a 2-hour ride by supply boat from the mainland, and once I got there, the guy who dropped me off just said, "Radio in if something breaks. Otherwise, enjoy the peace." At first, it was everything I hoped it would be. The sound of the waves, the endless sky, and the clean air made it feel like a retreat. There was enough food to last a month, a bunk, a library of old books and journals, and a working ham radio. They'd even installed solar panels with battery backups, so electricity wasn't an issue. I settled into a routine: wake up early, make coffee, log weather conditions, walk the island perimeter, check on the generator and batteries, then read or fish until dark. By the 3rd night, I noticed the sounds. The lighthouse groaned more than I expected. The wind rattled things in strange rhythms. I chalked it up to age, salt, and solitude playing tricks. But then I started hearing what I thought were footsteps above me, on the spiral metal stairs leading to the lantern room. That distinct clang of a boot on steel. It only happened at night, maybe between 2 and 3 a.m., and always just 1 or 2 steps. No creaking, no full walk. Just movement. Then silence. I finally climbed up one night after hearing it. I carried a flashlight and moved slow, keeping my breath shallow. I expected maybe an animal had gotten in, a seagull, maybe, or a raccoon that somehow swam over. But the lantern room was empty. The trapdoor was closed. Nothing. The next morning, I noticed one of the old logbooks had been pulled from the shelf and left on the floor near my bunk. I hadn't touched it. It wasn't dusty like the rest. It looked recently handled. Inside, someone had underlined a section in red pencil, something about the watchman returning, dated 1912. I stopped sleeping well after that. The story in the logbook was vague. The keeper back then, Samuel Vance, had complained about hearing things. He'd written about how he would hear someone pacing in the lantern room. One night, he swore he saw a figure standing in the glass, staring out to sea. The entry stopped there. The next day's log was in different handwriting. It read, "Weather clear, light operational, Vance not found." That's it. I went to the radio and asked for a mainland contact. I waited hours with no response. Static. It wasn't stormy, the sun was out. I double-checked the solar panels and batteries, all fine. It just wasn't working. On day 7, I heard the foghorn sound for the first time. It wasn't supposed to. The new system didn't have a foghorn. It was removed 10 years ago, according to the orientation paperwork. But at 2:12 a.m., a low, deep moan rolled across the island. It was distant, like something underwater. And then, boots, again. I started writing things down, documenting times, noises, temperatures, trying to make sense of it, maybe find a pattern. Each night, it got worse. One night, I woke to the unmistakable sound of whispering, male voices murmuring in some fast rhythm I couldn't understand. I moved through the station with my flashlight and didn't find anyone. Then the dreams started. The first was of the sea, violent and rising, waves crashing against the base of the lighthouse. In it, I stood at the top, watching a man below, tied to the rocks by heavy ropes, screaming. Then silence. Then the light above me flickered and went out. In another dream, I was in the lantern room. The light rotated slowly behind me, and someone stood at the window, back to me, tall, dressed in a black peacoat. When I called out, the figure turned, but it had no face, just wet, dripping skin where features should have been. On day 12, I found something new. While doing a walk around the island, I noticed a piece of rope tied to the metal railing on the east side. It hadn't been there before. It looked old, frayed and dry-rotted, and knotted like it had been used to tie something down. That night, the dream returned, clearer now. The man in the coat was speaking. I kept the light on. I did what they asked. The next morning, I tried the radio again. Still nothing. No signal, just intermittent popping sounds. That afternoon, I checked the logbooks again, starting from the back, and I found another entry not in my handwriting. Keeper reported missing. Light malfunctioning. Rope snapped. Fog thick. He's still watching. No date. Just that. The wind picked up that night. It was the worst storm since I arrived. Waves slammed the rocks so hard that I could feel them through the floor. I stayed up in the lantern room trying to keep the beacon turning, though it was mostly automated. It felt like something wanted me up there, like I had to be there. At 3:04 a.m., I saw a ship. No lights, no sound, just a long black shape cutting through the water just past the rocks. I blinked, and it was gone. The foghorn blew again, twice this time. Then silence. I went downstairs, and at the bottom of the stairwell just before the trapdoor, someone had scratched a message into the paint. Keep the light on. By day 16, I stopped sleeping. I was down to cans of beans and dry crackers because I couldn't go outside anymore. Every time I stepped out past sundown, I felt watched. Not just paranoia, but like something was actively aware of me. I kept the lighthouse lit, even during the day. The lantern room became the only place I felt somewhat safe. The night of the 17th day broke me. It was about 2:30 a.m. when the light began spinning rapidly on its own. Too fast. The mechanism wasn't capable of that speed. The glass panels shook. I went up to stop it, but when I opened the trapdoor to the lantern room, the man was there, just like in the dreams. Same coat, same soaking wet skin, same faceless head. But this time he wasn't looking out to sea. He turned to me. I fell backward and slammed the trapdoor shut. He never made a sound, but I could hear footsteps pacing above me for the rest of the night. Constant, back and forth. Like he was waiting. The next morning, the steps were gone. I gathered my things. The boat wasn't due for another week, but I couldn't stay. I had to try the emergency flare. I hiked down to the dock and fired it into the sky, but no one came. That night, the whispers returned, closer now, inside the room. I could hear them just beyond the door. I stayed locked in the supply room, flashlight and knife in hand, counting the minutes until daylight. Day 19, I decided to swim for it. I took a life vest and waited for the tide to be lowest. The mainland was far, too far, but maybe another island or fishing vessel would spot me. I made it 20 yards before I felt something tug at my ankle. Not a cramp. Something pulled. I turned, flailed, and barely made it back to shore. There were rope burns on my ankle when I got out. Rope. That night, I stayed in the lantern room. I kept the light on. Every 30 seconds, the beam cut through the darkness. Outside, fog swallowed everything. The only sound was the rotating gear and the wind. Then for the first time I heard him speak. Not in a dream. Not in my head. You're the keeper now. Clear. Deep. Right beside me. I turned and saw nothing. But my heart had stopped. I could feel the cold in my bones. The next days blurred together. I remember trying to ration my food. I remember writing more notes in the log, though I doubt they made sense. Sometimes I found them rewritten or edited. Words I never wrote added between lines. He waits. Don't leave the post. Light for the lost. On day 25, the radio worked again. A faint voice came through, distorted but real. This is Camden Coast Guard. Do you read? I screamed into the receiver. Told them everything. I begged them to come get me. The voice paused, then said, We'll be there in the morning. Hang tight. But they never came. The next night, I found the trapdoor to the lantern room bolted shut from the outside. I hadn't done it. I was locked in. The light kept turning, but the sound was wrong. Clicks and pops like bone snapping. That was the longest night of my life. The next morning, the boat arrived. The man on it didn't look surprised to see me. He just said, They told me you were overdue. He didn't ask why I looked like I hadn't slept in a week. He didn't ask about the rope burns or why I refused to speak until we hit the mainland. I tried to explain to the officials. I even handed over the logbooks. They said the pages were blank. No handwriting, no red marks, no scratched messages. And the old keeper, Samuel Vance, they had no record of him. No death certificate, no missing persons report, just a weathered plaque on the lighthouse base that read, "In memory of the lost keepers who kept the light for those who never returned." I never took another solitary job again, and at night sometimes I still dream of the foghorn, still wake to the sound of footsteps above me. Story the end. The first time I heard about the Point Simmons Lighthouse, it was from an old-timer down at the marina in Rockport, Maine. He had that weathered look, like a man who'd spent too many years wrestling with the sea. He told me it was one of the most haunted spots on the coast, a place where the fog never quite lifts and the past bleeds into the present. I was skeptical, as anyone might be. Ghost stories in fishing towns are as common as seagulls. But after what happened to me that fall, I don't doubt it for a second. I got the job in early September of 2018. I had just graduated from college and wanted a break from the usual grind, something different to test myself. The Point Simmons Lighthouse was staffed by a seasonal keeper for a few months each year, responsible for maintaining the light, monitoring weather conditions, and keeping the place secure. The pay wasn't great, but the solitude appealed to me. I'd always been drawn to the ocean, the endless horizon, the crashing waves, the smell of salt in the air. The lighthouse itself sat on a craggy outcrop a mile offshore from the mainland. The only way to get there was by boat, which ran twice daily, weather permitting. When I arrived, the keeper's quarters were modest, a small two-story building attached to the lighthouse tower with basic furnishings and a wood stove that someone had left stacked with enough logs for a few days. The first week went smoothly. The fog rolled in thick at night, and the light rotated steadily, casting its beam out over the water. I spent most days fixing the railing that had rusted through, cleaning lenses, and logging weather data. At night, I read books left by previous keepers and listened to the faint whistle of the wind as it funneled through the rocks. On the 8th night, the first strange thing happened. I was in bed when I heard the knock. Not a soft tap, but a solid, deliberate knock, 3 times on the wooden door leading to the tower. I sat up, heart pounding, and called out, but there was no answer. I told myself it was just the wind, the kind that can rattle shutters and mimic voices when the fog rolls in. But the knocking didn't stop. It came again a few minutes later, this time softer, from somewhere inside the tower itself. Curiosity mixed with unease. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed the spiral staircase inside the lighthouse, the beam cutting through the darkness. The stairs creaked beneath my feet, and the smell of salt and old stone filled the air. At the bottom landing, I stopped and listened. The knocking had ceased, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed against my ears. I chalked it up to an animal, maybe a raccoon or a seagull somehow finding its way inside. But as I moved through the rooms, the silence was thick, unnatural. I found no sign of anything out of place. Still, my skin prickled, and I hurried back to my quarters. Over the next several days, the knocking continued. It always came at the same time, just after midnight, always 3 knocks on the tower door or the window nearest my bed. I tried to record the sound on my phone, but each night the battery was dead in the morning, despite charging it during the day. One night, the knocking changed. It became a faint whisper, almost like someone calling my name, soft and distant, but unmistakable. I thought I was losing my mind. I told myself to get some sleep, but the fog was thick, the wind low and cold, and the sense of being watched grew heavier. About 2 weeks in, I found an old logbook in a locked drawer. It was dusty and brittle, like filled with handwritten notes from previous keepers dating back to the 1950s. I spent hours reading through them. Most were mundane, documenting weather, repairs, and supply runs, but some entries stood out. A keeper named Samuel, writing in 1962, mentioned hearing the knocking too. October 15. The knocking came again last night. 3 sharp knocks, steady like a warning. Checked the tower. No one. The fog was thick, but I swear I saw a shadow moving near the lantern room. Another entry from 1978 by a woman named Claire said, "Knocking at midnight. It never stops. It's like the lighthouse is trying to speak. I dreamt of a girl in blue standing on the rocks below. She looked lost. I fear I am not alone here." The last entry was dated 1984, after which the logs stopped abruptly. One night, near the end of September, I was sitting on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the waves when I saw her. A figure standing on the rocky shore below the lighthouse, framed by the cold moonlight filtering through the mist. She was slender, wearing a long blue dress, her hair dark and dripping as if she'd just risen from the water. Her eyes met mine, and she raised a pale hand as if to beckon me down. I wanted to call out, but my voice caught in my throat. The figure vanished when I blinked. After that night, things escalated. The knocking turned to pounding, echoing through the wooden walls, shaking the floorboards. Doors I'd locked creaked open on their own. The lights sometimes stopped rotating, freezing in place as if frozen in time. I saw shadows flitting at the edges of my vision, but when I turned, there was nothing there. One evening, the radio suddenly crackled to life, and I heard faint music, an old sea shanty, drifting through the static. The song was haunting and slow, and I sung by a woman's voice that chilled me to the bone. I tried calling out, but the voice faded and the radio went silent. The nights were the worst. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the girl in blue standing on the rocks, always watching, always waiting. On the 24th night, the storm came. A howling wind tore at the lighthouse, rain lashing the windows and shaking the walls. The power flickered and the old generator sputtered to life with a cough. The knocking became frantic, a desperate tattoo against the door and walls. I pulled on my raincoat and climbed the tower stairs, my flashlight barely cutting through the storm-darkened glass. At the top, the lantern room was cold and wet, mist swirling inside the glass enclosure. And there she was, the girl, standing beside the light. Her eyes were hollow, empty sockets glowing faintly with an unnatural blue. She raised her hand, pointing toward the sea. I turned to look and saw, through the thick curtain of rain, a small boat struggling against the waves, its mast broken and torn. I realized in horror that the girl was warning me, a ghost tethered to the past. I ran down and radioed the Coast Guard, managing to get through just as the storm reached its peak. They dispatched a rescue team, but the boat was lost, swallowed by the sea by morning. After that night, the haunting didn't stop, but something changed. The knocking grew softer, the whispers more distant. The girl stopped appearing on the rocks, but sometimes stood at the top of the tower, watching me silently. I finished my shift and left Point Simmons, but the memories linger. Sometimes, when the wind howls just right, I hear 3 knocks on my door. And once, in a dream, I stood at the base of the lighthouse as the light froze, and the girl in blue reached out, beckoning me back. I don't know what she was or what she wanted. Maybe a soul trapped by tragedy, bound to warn others of the dangers lurking beneath the waves, or maybe just a lonely spirit waiting for someone to see her story. All I know is that the Point Simmons Lighthouse isn't just a beacon for ships. It's a beacon for the restless, the lost, and the forgotten. Story the end. The old lighthouse on Cranberry Point had been out of commission for decades. Situated on a jagged cliff overlooking the churning Atlantic, it was a relic of a time when ships relied on the steadfast beam of a keeper to navigate treacherous shores. The townsfolk of the small Maine village nearby spoke of it with a mixture of reverence and unease, weaving whispered tales about the last keeper who vanished one stormy night, never to be seen again. I was drawn to the place like a moth to a flame. As a freelance journalist with a penchant for local legends, I had heard stories about the Cranberry Point Lighthouse for years. The tales were too good to pass up, especially the ones about the ghostly presence that was said to haunt its weathered walls. I wanted to find the truth, if only to debunk the myths. I arrived on a cold, rainy October afternoon. The wind was sharp and salty, carrying the endless roar of the sea beneath thick gray clouds. The lighthouse itself was a towering, weather-beaten structure, white paint peeling and stained with rust and salt. The keeper's house adjacent to it was boarded up, windows shuttered against the elements. A rusty gate barred the narrow path leading up to the lighthouse, but the latch had been broken, inviting me in. I took a deep breath and stepped onto the path, the gravel crunching beneath my boots. The air was heavy with the smell of seaweed and decay. My plan was simple. Spend a night in the abandoned keeper's house, gather whatever stories I could from locals, and explore the lighthouse itself. I'd brought a portable recorder, a camera, and enough gear to survive a cold night. Inside the house, the air was stale and cold. Dust lay thick on the floorboards, and the furniture was coated in sheets of plastic, yellowed and torn. I set down my backpack and lit a small lantern, the flickering flame casting long shadows against the cracked walls. There was an old fireplace with ashes still faintly visible, and shelves lined with rusted cans and forgotten trinkets. It was easy to imagine the loneliness that must have seeped into these walls over the years. I set up my sleeping bag near a window that looked out to the lighthouse. Outside, the beacon was dark now, of course. It hadn't shone in over 50 years. But even in its silence, the tower exuded a strange presence, a sentinel frozen in time, watching endlessly over the sea. I spent the evening writing notes and reviewing my questions. I wanted to talk to anyone who knew about the last keeper, a man named Thomas Halbrook. According to town records, Thomas had been the lighthouse keeper from 1928 until his disappearance in 1943. The official story said he'd been swept out to sea during a fierce storm, but the locals whispered of something more sinister. Around 9 o'clock, I decided to take a walk to the base of the lighthouse, flashlight in hand. The wind had picked up, and the rain fell in cold sheets. The path was slippery, and the rocks beneath my feet slick with algae. The lighthouse door was padlocked shut, but I noticed a small side door slightly ajar. I pushed it open with a creak. Inside, the smell was overpowering. Damp stone, rusted metal, and a faint, inexplicable scent of old tobacco. The spiral staircase wound upward into darkness, the sound of the storm muffled by thick walls. I called out, my voice swallowed by the emptiness. As I climbed, the light of my flashlight flickered. I chalked it up to the old batteries and kept going. The stairs creaked beneath my weight, and at times I thought I heard the scrape of something following behind me. I stopped, held my breath, but nothing answered. Reaching the lantern room at the top, I peered out over the sea. The waves crashed wildly against the rocks below, white foam glowing faintly under the stormy sky. I shone my light around the circular room, illuminating the rusted machinery that once turned the great lens. It was then I noticed it, a figure standing just beyond the glass on the narrow catwalk that circled the towers outside. At first, I thought it was a trick of the storm, a shadow cast by lightning or my imagination playing games. But the figure was solid, a man dressed in a tattered oilskin coat and hat, looking out toward the ocean with a heavy sadness. I called out softly, "Hello? Are you okay?" The figure turned slowly toward me. His eyes were hollow, distant. For a moment his mouth moved as if to speak, but no sound came. Then, just as suddenly as he'd appeared, he vanished into the night. I stumbled backward, heart pounding. When I regained my composure, I descended the stairs quickly, my flashlight flickering with increasing frequency until it died altogether. In the pitch-black stairwell, I felt a coldness wash over me, as though the air itself had turned to ice. Back on the ground, rain drenched my clothes, and I ran to the house, slamming the door behind me. I lit the lantern and sat down, trying to steady my nerves. I recorded everything I'd seen and heard on my voice recorder, hoping to capture evidence of what I could only describe as a ghost. Sleep was impossible that night. Every creak, every whisper of wind against the house felt like footsteps. At one point, I swore I heard a faint tapping on the window, a slow, rhythmic knock that sent a chill down my spine. The next morning, I headed into town to speak with the locals. At the diner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Espine Simmons took my order and immediately noticed my interest in the lighthouse. "Most folks stay away from that place," she said quietly, her eyes darting toward the window. "Old Halbrook's spirit doesn't take kindly to strangers." I asked her to tell me more. She leaned in. "Thomas was a good man, dedicated to his job, but after his wife died during childbirth, he became a recluse, kept to the lighthouse day and night. Some say he started talking to the sea itself, hearing voices no one else could hear." "What happened to him?" I asked. "During a storm much worse than this one," she said, nodding toward the rain outside. "He disappeared. They found his coat and lantern near the cliffs, but no sign of him. Some say he walked into the sea on purpose to be with his wife. Others say he was taken." "Taken?" I echoed. "The sea has a way of claiming what it wants," she whispered. "And some nights his light still shines, guiding ships, warning sailors, though the tower's been dead for years." I thanked Mrs. Simmons and left the diner, the story settling heavy in my mind. That night, I decided to stay in the keeper's house once more, hoping to capture something, anything, on my recorder. The storm had worsened, wind howling like a banshee outside. Around midnight, the tapping began again. Slow, deliberate knocks on the window closest to my bed. I sat up, heart racing, and stared into the darkness. Then I heard a voice, a low, mournful whisper, barely audible over the storm. "Help!" I grabbed my recorder and spoke softly. "Who's there?" The whisper came again, clearer this time. "Help me!" I got out of bed and approached the window. Outside, the storm raged, but I saw nothing. No footprints, no figure, only the crashing waves and the swaying branches of a nearby tree. Suddenly, the room grew cold, and the lantern flickered violently. The whisper turned into a low moan, circling me like the wind. Frozen, I watched as a faint blue glow formed near the doorway. Slowly, the figure of a man appeared, withered, sorrowful, eyes filled with longing. It was Thomas Halbrook. He raised a shaking hand and pointed toward the lighthouse. His voice, though wordless, echoed in my mind. The light must never go out. Before I could react, he vanished, leaving the room dark and silent. The next morning, I found myself drawn again to the lighthouse. I retrieved the padlock key from my bag, a spare I'd taken earlier, and unlocked the door. Inside, I found the machinery still intact, though covered in rust. I climbed to the lantern room and examined the great Fresnel lens. There was a small lever, corroded but functional, that looked like it could turn the light on. On a whim, I pulled it. The beacon sputtered, then roared to life, casting a brilliant beam across the fog-shrouded sea. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see the spectral form of Thomas standing at the edge of the catwalk, his face peaceful for the first time. He nodded once, slowly, then faded into the night. From that moment on, the lighthouse remained lit, a guiding light for the few ships that still passed. I left Cranberry Point shortly after, but I never forgot the feeling of standing there, watching the ghost of a man who had kept his promise even beyond death. I later learned the town decided to preserve the light as an official beacon once more, a tribute to Thomas Halbrook's dedication. Sometimes on foggy nights, the villagers say you can still see the silhouette of a man in the lantern room, watching the horizon, keeping the light burning for those lost at sea. Story the end. The wind off the Atlantic was biting cold that November evening as I arrived at the West Point Lighthouse, perched on a jagged stretch of Maine's rocky coast. The job was temporary, just a few weeks to help the small local historical society renovate the old lighthouse for the upcoming tourist season. I had worked a few odd jobs in my life, but this one felt different the moment I stepped out of my truck and took in the salty, briny air and the lonely tower standing like a sentinel against the churning sea. I was used to isolation, having grown up in a small town, but this was something else. The lighthouse stood alone on a narrow peninsula jutting out into the Atlantic, surrounded by sharp rocks and turbulent waves. The nearest neighbor was miles away. The keeper's house beside the lighthouse was a modest two-story cottage with peeling white paint and narrow windows rimmed with frost. The local society had furnished it with a small cot, a rickety kitchen table, and a wood stove that struggled to keep the chill at bay. I was introduced to Eleanor, the town's elderly historian, who handed me a thick ring of keys and a sheaf of papers detailing the work to be done. She warned me to respect the history of the place and to be careful at night. The cliffs were dangerous, and there had been some unfortunate accidents over the years. As she left, I could see the way her eyes lingered on the lighthouse tower, a mixture of reverence and something else. Unease, maybe. She told me not to be alarmed if I heard strange noises or footsteps when I was alone. "The lighthouse has its own memories," she said softly. That first night, I settled into the keeper's quarters with a thermos of coffee and a book. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and the sea pounded relentlessly against the rocks. The light atop the tower had long been extinguished, replaced decades ago by a modern beacon further inland, but the Fresnel lens still gleamed faintly in the darkness. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps ascending the spiral staircase of the tower. The building groaned beneath the weight, and the creaks echoed down the halls. I sat up, heart pounding, listening intently. The footsteps stopped at the landing outside my door. A faint chill brushed my neck, and then silence. I told myself it was probably just the old house settling, or maybe a raccoon trapped inside. But the next morning, I found muddy footprints leading from the tower to the edge of the cliffs, disappearing into the fog that hung low over the water. The weather grew worse over the next few days. Fierce storms rolled in from the ocean, lashing the lighthouse with rain and gusts that shook the windows. I stayed mostly inside, making repairs and tidying up, but the feeling of being watched never left me. On the third night, I awoke to whispering voices. They seemed to come from the walls themselves, fragmented, unintelligible, but persistent. I tried to ignore them, pulling the blankets over my head. The following morning, I explored the lighthouse archives stored in the small basement room. Among old journals and logbooks, I found entries from the last official keeper, a man named Samuel Turner, who had served in the late 1800s. His last entry mentioned strange lights on the water and a presence that haunted the tower. As the days passed, the disturbances grew more frequent. Doors I had locked would be open again. Tools would disappear, only to be found carefully stacked on the windowsill. At times, I caught glimpses of a shadowy figure at the edge of my vision, tall, wearing a long coat and a brimmed hat, standing silently by the cliffs. One evening, during a particularly violent storm, the power went out. The house plunged into darkness, except for the occasional flash of lightning illuminating the waves crashing below. I lit candles and tried to keep calm. Then, from the tower, came the unmistakable sound of the foghorn, slow, mournful, and deep. But the foghorn had been decommissioned for decades. I grabbed my coat and flashlight, determined to investigate. The spiral staircase was slick with rainwater leaking in through cracks. At the top, the lantern room was empty, but the old foghorn mechanism stood silent. Still, the sound had been real. Suddenly, the air grew icy cold, and a figure appeared at the window, the same tall man from before. His eyes were dark hollows, and his face was pale as the moonlight. I stumbled back, heart-hammering. "Why are you here?" I whispered. The figure raised a translucent hand pointing toward the sea, where the lightning briefly revealed a small fishing boat tossed like a toy on the raging waves. The next morning, I learned from the local radio that a small fishing vessel had capsized near the lighthouse the previous night. The crew was missing, presumed lost. That night, I dreamed of the man again, Samuel Turner. He was trying to warn me, trapped between worlds, reliving his failure to save those at sea. On my final night, as I packed to leave, the whispers returned, softer now, almost a song. The temperature warmed and the feeling of dread lifted. Before I drove away, I climbed the lighthouse one last time. At the top, I placed a small bouquet of wildflowers I had picked, leaving them beside the Fresnel lens. As I looked out over the storm-battered coast, the first rays of dawn broke through the clouds, casting a gentle light over the water. I didn't hear the footsteps that night, nor see the figure by the cliffs. But sometimes late at night, when the wind howls just right, I swear I can hear the faint, mournful foghorn calling out from West Point Lighthouse, a reminder that some spirits linger, bound by duty and tragedy, waiting for peace. Story the end. The first time I heard about the lighthouse was from an old friend of mine, Greg. We grew up in a small coastal town in Maine where lighthouses dotted the rocky shores like sentinels guarding the Atlantic. Greg was the type of guy who loved telling ghost stories, especially ones tied to real places. One evening, around a campfire on the beach, he mentioned the Blackstone Lighthouse, a small, isolated beacon on a craggy island about 2 miles off the coast. The place had been automated for decades, but people said the original keeper never left. Some even claimed he still kept the light burning. I thought it was just local legend, the kind of story fishermen tell to pass the time on cold nights. But Greg's story stuck with me, especially when years later, I got a job as a seasonal maintenance worker for the Coast Guard. Part of my duties was to visit various lighthouses along the New England coast, including Blackstone. The timing was late fall, right before winter would make the trip impossible. The first trip to Blackstone was memorable, but not for the reasons I expected. I took a small Coast Guard boat from the mainland early in the morning. The water was cold and choppy, but the sun was out and the sky was clear. The island was little more than a rugged rock outcrop, with the lighthouse standing tall in the center, its white paint faded and chipped from years of exposure. The keeper's house next door was boarded up, windows covered with weathered plywood. There was a small dock, barely stable, and as I tied the boat, I felt an odd chill despite the sunshine. My job was simple: check the automated light, ensure the solar panels were clean, clear debris from the access path, and inspect the generator. It was my first time alone on a lighthouse, and honestly, I thought it would be boring. But as I started my rounds, I couldn't shake a creeping unease. Inside, the lighthouse smelled like old salt and rust. The metal staircase creaked underfoot as I climbed to the lantern room. The light was working perfectly, blinking steadily as programmed. But when I looked out over the water, I noticed something strange. There was a faint glow coming from the old keeper's house, which shouldn't have had power at all. I shook my head and dismissed it as a trick of the light. But when I got closer, I saw that one of the boarded-up windows had been pried open just enough for a sliver of light to escape. That was the moment I heard it, the slow, deliberate sound of footsteps on the wooden floor inside the house. Heavy steps, dragging slightly. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" No answer. I circled the building, flashlights sweeping over the cracked boards and peeling paint. The door was locked tight, no way in without a key. The footsteps stopped as abruptly as they began. That night, I camped in a small cabin on the mainland, still unsettled. I told a few colleagues about the light and footsteps, but they just laughed and said the place was known for its ghost stories. "Blackstone's got a reputation," one said. "The old keeper went mad and disappeared in the 40s. Folks say he never left." The next week, I was assigned a longer stay on the island to conduct more thorough maintenance. This time, I took food, supplies, and a small cot. I arrived just as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky red and purple. The cold hit me immediately as I stepped off the boat. The wind howled around the rocks, carrying with it the faint, salty scent of decay. I lit a lantern and made my way to the keeper's house, planning to use it as my shelter. The door was locked, but the old metal key the Coast Guard provided fit perfectly. The door creaked open, revealing a musty, dim interior. Dust hung thick in the air. I set up my cot in the corner and started a small fire in the old stove. As I settled in, the wind outside picked up, rattling the windows. Then I heard it again, the slow dragging footsteps, pacing back and forth in the room above. I froze, listening. The sound was unmistakable. But when I called out, silence. No reply, just the relentless pacing. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw a shadowy figure at the top of the lighthouse stairs. A man in a weather-beaten coat and hat, his face obscured by darkness. Sometimes I thought I heard his voice whispering through the walls, carried on the wind, "Keep the light burning." On the third day, I climbed the lighthouse to check the light mechanism. The wind was gusting fiercely, and the sky was a uniform gray, threatening a storm. As I reached the lantern room, I noticed the glass was streaked with handprints, large, smeared, and filthy. I wiped them off, but as I looked down into the swirling sea below, I could have sworn I saw a figure watching me from the rocks. Back inside the keeper's house, the temperature dropped sharply. My breath came out in frosty clouds. The fire in the stove sputtered and died. The radio crackled with static, then a faint voice whispered, "Don't go." Panic rising, I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside, but the wind was so strong it nearly knocked me over. The storm arrived in full force that evening, trapping me inside the house. The power flickered and died. My only light was the lantern, which cast dancing shadows on the walls. Around midnight, the footsteps returned, louder and more insistent. They weren't pacing anymore. They were coming toward the stairs, slow and deliberate. I grabbed the flare gun I had with me and aimed it toward the ceiling, but nothing happened. Then a cold hand grabbed my shoulder. I spun around, but there was no one there. The room fell silent. The storm raged outside, rain lashing the windows. When dawn came, the sun broke through the clouds and the temperature rose. I left the island the next day and didn't look back. When I told my supervisors what happened, they nodded knowingly. "You encountered the keeper," one said. "He's been watching that light for 70 years. Years later, I found an old newspaper clipping in a maritime museum. It told of John Halsey, the Blackstone keeper who vanished in 1948. His body was never found, but fishermen reported seeing a man in a coat standing by the light during storms, warning ships away. Some nights, when the fog rolls in thick along the Maine coast, I swear I can see that light flashing, steady and unwavering, as if someone is still keeping watch. Story the end. The first time I saw the lighthouse at Devil's Point, I wasn't looking for ghosts or horror stories. I was just a kid with a summer job, eager to escape the small town in New Hampshire where I grew up. The job was simple: be the summer caretaker for the lighthouse, keep it clean, make sure the light worked, and report any maintenance issues. Devil's Point Lighthouse was on a small island just off the Maine coast, reachable only by boat, and it had been automated years ago, but the Coast Guard still needed someone to watch over the place during the busy season. I arrived on the island in early June, the salty wind whipping my jacket as the boat pulled away and left me alone. The lighthouse stood tall and white against the dark Atlantic backdrop, its light beaming out over the waves every 15 seconds. The keeper's cottage was a weather-beaten wooden shack a few hundred feet from the lighthouse itself. There, the place was cozy in a rough sort of way. Creaky floors, faded wallpaper, and a single propane stove that did most of the cooking. I had just started settling in when the first strange thing happened. It was the second night, and the wind was low, the sea calm. I was sitting on the porch, drinking black coffee and watching the moonlight dance across the water when I heard the faintest sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was my imagination. After all, I was alone on the island. But then the footsteps came again, slow and deliberate, climbing the metal stairs inside the lighthouse tower. The sound echoed up through the stairwell, metal clanging under weight that wasn't mine. I grabbed a flashlight and climbed the spiral stairs myself, calling out, but the lighthouse was empty. No one there. I shook it off as nerves. Maybe I was just hearing the building settling or the wind in the iron railings. But the footsteps continued every night after that, always around 2 or 3 in the morning. Always just a few steps, then silence. The next morning, I found an old, rusted lantern at the base of the stairs, one that hadn't been there before. It looked decades old, with peeling glass and corroded metal. I asked the Coast Guard captain when I called in my daily report, and he said there were no extra lanterns in the lighthouse. I left it on the porch as a kind of odd souvenir. Over the first week, the isolation got to me. The radio was patchy, and cell reception was non-existent. The supply boat only came once a week, and the nights were long and dark. I kept a journal, recording weather, maintenance, and the strange noises. One night, during a thick fog, I heard a low moan coming from the direction of the shore. It was deep and mournful, like a foghorn, but the lighthouse hadn't had a foghorn for years. I checked the weather instruments. No storms or bad weather predicted. The sound came again, louder this time, sending chills down my spine. The foghorn was followed by a sudden crash near the boat dock. I grabbed my flashlight and ran down, but all I found were broken pieces of an old wooden crate scattered on the rocks. No sign of anyone. By the second week, the footsteps escalated. They were louder, heavier, and sometimes they sounded like a whole group of people pacing the spiral staircase. The lantern room window sometimes had a faint glow, even when the light was turned off. I started to dream of a man in old-fashioned clothing, standing at the top of the lighthouse, staring out at a stormy sea. His face was obscured by shadows, but I felt a cold weight of sadness and responsibility from him. One afternoon, while cleaning the windows, I noticed a faded inscription scratched into the glass: Keeper Whitman, 1912. Curious, I dug into the old journals left behind in the cottage. There was a partial record of Thomas Whitman, the lighthouse keeper who had vanished without a trace during a hurricane in October 1912. His last entry was chilling. The storm rages. The light must not go out. The men lost at sea call for me, but I cannot leave my post. I will keep the flame burning, even in death. That night, the dreams worsened. I saw the man again, but this time he reached out as if pleading for help. I woke in a cold sweat to the sound of the light flickering violently. I ran up the stairs to find the Fresnel lens spinning uncontrollably, casting fractured beams of light through the foggy glass. The metal railing felt icy cold to the touch. I tried calling the Coast Guard, but the radio was dead. No signal, just static. The foghorn moaned again, mournful and relentless. On the 15th day, I heard footsteps outside the cottage door. When I opened it, no one was there, but the ground was littered with seaweed and driftwood, arranged in a circle around the doorstep. I stayed inside that night, too afraid to move. The whispers came then, soft voices in a language I couldn't understand, swirling through the rooms like a ghostly wind. On the 17th day, the light went out completely during the middle of a thick storm. I climbed the stairs, heart pounding, and found the lantern room door locked from the inside. No matter how hard I pushed and pulled, I couldn't open it. Suddenly, a shadow moved past the window, the silhouette of a man in a long coat. I called out, but he didn't answer. The glass fogged over with cold breath, and I felt a hand brush my arm. Panicking, I fell down the stairs and scrambled to the radio, desperately signaling for help. The radio crackled alive briefly, a voice distorted and faint. Keep the light, do not leave your post." Then silence again. When the supply boat arrived on day 20, they found me exhausted, pale, and rambling about ghosts and haunted footsteps. I handed over the logbook, but the captain only frowned and said the journals were blank, pages torn out or filled with nonsense. Back on the mainland, I tried to shake it off, but I still hear the distant foghorn on foggy nights, and sometimes the metal clang of footsteps when I'm alone. They say the sea takes its own, but some keepers never leave. Story the end. The first time I heard about Devil's Point Lighthouse, it was from an old Coast Guard buddy of mine named Charlie. We'd served together years back, and Charlie had a reputation for knowing the darker, weirder corners of the East Coast. When he mentioned the lighthouse, his voice dropped to a whisper, and there was a nervous edge to him I hadn't heard before. "You don't want to take that job," he said over the phone. "People don't talk about it much, but something's wrong there. The keepers vanish, or worse. It's like the place traps you." I was fresh out of college, broke, and desperate for work. I had studied maritime history, loved lighthouses, and figured a summer at Devil's Point could be just the thing. Some quiet, solitude, and a chance to write. So I ignored Charlie's warnings. Devil's Point Lighthouse stood on a sharp cliff overlooking the Atlantic in northern Maine. Built in the late 1800s, it was a classic structure, whitewashed tower with red trim and a keeper's house attached. The place was remote, accessible only by a narrow, winding road that disappeared into dense forest before reaching the rocky coast. I arrived in early June, hauling my bags up the stone steps under a sky thick with gray clouds. The house was small, cramped, and smelled of salt and old wood. Inside, peeling paint flaked from the walls, and dust settled on every surface. The keeper before me had left abruptly, leaving a scattering of personal items, an old Navy cap, a dog-eared journal, a half-empty bottle of whiskey. The electricity was finicky. I was told to rely on the generator and keep the oil lamps fueled in case of a blackout. My first few days were peaceful. The lighthouse's beam swept rhythmically over the waves, warning ships away from the jagged rocks below. I kept the logs, tested the equipment, and recorded weather conditions as instructed. At night, the only sounds were the crashing surf and the mournful cry of distant seabirds. I'd sit on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the fog roll in thick and fast, swallowing the sea. On the third night, I began to notice something strange. As I was closing the shutters in the keeper's quarters, I heard footsteps crunching on the gravel outside. They paced slowly back and forth, just beyond the porch light's reach. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, calling into the mist, but no one answered. The footsteps stopped as suddenly as they'd begun. The next morning, I found strange marks in the gravel near the edge of the cliff. A set of footprints, barefoot, deep and heavy, but no sign of where they'd come from. The tracks disappeared at the cliff's edge, as if whoever had walked there had vanished into thin air. I tried to rationalize it, maybe an animal, or a local fisherman making a late-night visit. But no one was supposed to be around at night, and the footprints didn't match any animal I knew. That night, the feeling of being watched settled in. I heard faint whispers carried on the wind, indecipherable and hollow. Sometimes I thought I saw figures moving just beyond the fog, shapes that disappeared when I tried to focus. Then I found the journal. It was tucked beneath the floorboards in the bedroom, yellowed and brittle. The entries belonged to a man named Samuel Harrow, keeper in the early 1900s. His writing was frantic and fading with age. He wrote of storms that never ended, of ships lost to the sea, and of a shadow that haunted the cliffs. His last entries spoke of the ones who wait, restless souls trapped by tragedy bound to the lighthouse and the waters below. One passage chilled me. They come at night, pacing the stones, calling for release. I fear I am next. That night, as the wind screamed through the cracks in the walls, I awoke to the sound of footsteps again, this time inside the house. Heavy boots on creaking floors, slow and deliberate. I grabbed the flashlight and followed the sounds down the hall. The kitchen was empty, but the back door was wide open, letting in a cold, clammy fog. I slammed it shut and locked it, but the footsteps continued, circling above me on the stairwell. I climbed the narrow stairs to the tower, my breath visible in the cold air. At the top, the great Fresnel lens rotated silently, casting ghostly beams through the mist. I shone my flashlight around, but saw nothing. Then, out on the balcony, I saw him. A man, soaked to the bone, standing with his back to me, staring into the ocean. His clothes were tattered, his posture heavy with grief. I called out, but he didn't turn. The fog thickened, and when the light swept over him again, he was gone. The next days were worse. Shadows darted at the edges of my vision, objects moved when I wasn't looking, and cold spots followed me through the rooms. The radio crackled with static, and sometimes I thought I heard a faint voice pleading for help. One night, during a raging storm, the light in the tower flickered and died. I scrambled up the stairs to the lamp room, but the generator had failed, and the breakers were shot. As I worked to restart the power, I heard a voice whisper behind me, "Save us." I spun around, but the room was empty. The door slammed shut on its own, and the temperature dropped so quickly I could see my breath. I fumbled with the controls, heart racing, until the light finally flickered back on. Exhausted, I retreated to the quarters, but sleep didn't come. I dreamt of a shipwreck, the Mary Ellen, a schooner lost in a violent gale nearly a century ago. I saw the captain and crew struggling against the storm, then heard the captain's orders to abandon ship, leaving his men to drown. I woke with a start, cold and sweating. The next morning, I found the journal again. A new entry, freshly written. They call me captain. I betrayed my crew. Now I'm lost. I looked around the room, shaking. That afternoon, I drove into town and spoke with a local historian. She told me the story of the Mary Ellen in detail. The ship had vanished off Devil's Point in 1927 during a fierce storm, all hands lost. Legend said the captain survived by climbing to the lighthouse, but never left, haunted by guilt. Back at the lighthouse, I felt the presence grow stronger. At night, I heard voices chanting, saw flickering lanterns in the fog, and glimpsed the captain's ghost pacing the cliff edge, eyes hollow and haunted. One evening, determined to put an end to the haunting, I climbed the cliffs with a lantern and the journal, reading aloud the captain's confession and begging for forgiveness. The fog swirled violently, and for a moment the apparition appeared, his face serene for the first time. Then the wind carried his voice away. "Thank you." From that night on, the footsteps stopped. The cold spots faded. The fog still rolled in, and the ocean roared, but the lighthouse no longer felt like a trap. I finished my time at Devil's Point and left, but the story stayed with me. Every time I hear the cry of a distant foghorn or see a lighthouse beacon cutting through the night, I remember the souls bound to those lonely cliffs, waiting for someone to hear them. Story the end. The first time I heard about the Seabrook Lighthouse was from a grizzled old fisherman down in Cape Cod. He told me to stay away, said it was no place for the living. I was a young man then, freshly graduated with a degree in marine biology, and eager to spend a summer researching coastal ecosystems. The lighthouse was abandoned, or so I thought, a perfect base to set up camp while I did fieldwork. What I didn't know was that the place was more than just old bricks and rusted metal. It held a darkness that had lingered for nearly a century. I arrived in early June, hauling my gear through the thick underbrush along the rocky shoreline. The Seabrook Lighthouse stood on a small island about a mile offshore, reachable only by a rickety wooden bridge that the locals barely maintained. The tower was tall and narrow, white paint peeling at windows boarded up, but some cracked open to the salty air. Attached was a tiny keeper's house, sagging, but still standing. The first few days were peaceful enough. I set up my equipment inside the keeper's house and spent my mornings wading through tidal pools and mapping coastal flora. The island was wild, the waves constantly crashing against jagged rocks, seabirds circling overhead. At night, the moonlight painted silver ribbons across the ocean. But it was during those nights that the island seemed to shift. On the third evening, while I was reviewing samples, I heard footsteps outside the cottage. Not the gentle scuffing of my own boots, but heavy, deliberate thuds. I opened the door, flashlight in hand, but no one was there. The bridge creaked in the wind, though the air was still. Shrugging it off, I locked the door and returned to my notes. That night, the temperature dropped sharply. I woke to the sound of a woman singing. Soft, distant, and hauntingly beautiful. The voice seemed to drift from the lighthouse tower itself, mingling with the crash of waves. I leaned out the window, trying to see into the darkness, but the fog had rolled in thick and low. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt outside the cottage. They were small, barefoot prints leading toward the cliff edge and then disappearing into the seaweed. I hadn't seen anyone else on the island, and there was no boat or sign of a visitor. Curious, I searched the old lighthouse for any sign of recent activity. The spiral staircase inside was coated in dust and rust. At the top, the lantern room was dark and empty, the great Fresnel lens cracked and dull. I noticed a faded inscription carved into the wooden frame, Maureen, 1928. I'd been told stories about Maureen. She was the lighthouse keeper's daughter, a young woman who'd vanished one stormy night decades ago. Some said she'd drowned. Others whispered she'd been taken by something darker. The locals didn't talk much about it, but I was intrigued. That night I awoke to a cold draft and the sound of soft footsteps pacing above me. The cottage had no second floor. The footsteps circled the ceiling beam, stopping abruptly when I sat up, heart racing. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam around the room. Nothing, but the hairs on my neck stood on end. Over the following days, the strange occurrences grew. Objects shifted position, lights flickered, and the singing returned, always at night, always distant but clear. Once I saw a pale figure standing on the cliff edge, a woman in a white dress, her hair tangled and wet, gazing out to sea. When I approached, she vanished into the mist. I tried to record the sounds and capture images with my camera, but every time I played back the recordings, they were silent or filled with static. The photos showed nothing but empty landscape. Determined to understand, I delved into the lighthouse's history. Maureen's father, Thomas, had been the keeper from 1920 until his death in 1930. His last journal entry mentioned Maureen's increasing melancholy and her nightly walks along the cliffs. The final page was smeared with water stains and ended abruptly. One evening during a fierce thunderstorm, the lighthouse's old generator sputtered and died, plunging the cottage into darkness. As lightning split the sky, I heard a desperate knock at the door. Opening it, I found no one, just the howling wind and rain. Then a whisper, "Help me." Terrified, I followed the voice out to the cliff. There, beneath the raging sea, I glimpsed a shadowy figure struggling against the waves. The water surged, dragging the figure down as the storm raged on. I returned inside, shaken. The next morning, I found a small, weathered locket on the doorstep, engraved with the initials MC. Inside was a faded photograph of a young woman, the same woman I'd seen on the cliffs. After that night, the haunting ceased. The singing stopped, the footsteps faded, and the oppressive cold lifted. I left the island soon after, convinced that Maureen's restless spirit had finally found peace. To this day, the Seabrook Lighthouse stands guard over the coast, its walls silent witnesses to love, loss, and the mysteries hidden beneath the waves. Story the end. The east coast of Maine is littered with lighthouses, sturdy sentinels built to warn ships away from jagged rocks and treacherous shoals. Most are automated now, but some still require a human touch, a living keeper to maintain the light and tend the grounds. That was how I found myself at the East Point Lighthouse one chilly November, assigned as a temporary keeper for 4 weeks while the usual keeper was away. I'd been electrician in Boston for nearly a decade, and when the opportunity arose for a quiet, isolated gig, I jumped at the chance. The promise of solitude, crisp ocean air, and time away from the city noise was appealing. East Point was a solitary outpost, perched on a rocky promontory, accessible only by a narrow winding road that ended abruptly at the edge of the sea. The lighthouse was an imposing brick tower, attached to a modest two-story keeper's cottage that creaked with the history of generations. From the moment I arrived, the atmosphere felt different, heavier somehow, like the air carried more weight than usual. The wind howled against the windows as I settled in, unpacking my gear and preparing for my first night on watch. The job was simple: maintain the lamp, keep logs of the weather, check the equipment, and ensure the beacon was operational through the long, dark nights. The light was an old Fresnel lens, mesmerizing to watch as it slowly turned, casting its beam out over the Atlantic. At dusk, I climbed the spiral staircase to the lantern room and marveled as the beacon came alive, spinning steadily despite the wind and rain battering the glass. The first few days were uneventful. I followed my routine, recording wave heights, wind speeds, and temperature readings, all while getting used to the solitude and the constant crash of surf below. The only visitors were the occasional seabirds and the distant hum of fishing boats. But it didn't take long for the place to start feeling alive in ways I hadn't expected. The first night, I woke just after midnight to the sound of footsteps on the wooden floor outside my bedroom door. I sat up, heart pounding, listening intently. The footsteps stopped, then resumed, slow and deliberate, pacing back and forth. I flicked on my bedside lamp and grabbed the baseball bat I kept nearby. I called out, "Who's there?" But only silence answered. I opened the door to find the hallway empty. No sign of anyone. No footprints in the dust or mud. Nothing. I chalked it up to the old house settling or my imagination playing tricks on me. Still, I didn't sleep well. The next morning, I found a small waterlogged piece of paper slipped under the door. On it was a faded pencil sketch of the lighthouse with a note: "Keep the light burning." I showed it to no one. The nights continued with the footsteps, sometimes footsteps and faint murmurs just beyond hearing. The radio crackled with static and occasional bursts of what sounded like voices, though no broadcast could be identified. My flashlight flickered and died inexplicably, even with fresh batteries. One night, while making my way to the lantern room, I passed the old keeper's logbook sitting on a dusty shelf in the sitting room. The cover was cracked and brittle, the handwriting spidery and faint. I leafed through it and found entries dating back to the early 1900s. The entries told stories of fierce storms, shipwrecks, and lonely nights. But the later ones chilled me. References to a watcher who roamed the halls, unseen but ever present, warnings to never leave the light unattended, desperate pleas to stay vigilant. The last entry was dated nearly 50 years ago and ended abruptly. The fog thickens, and I fear I will not see the dawn. That night, the power went out. The storm outside had knocked down the lines feeding electricity to the island. The diesel generator wouldn't start, no matter how many times I pulled the cord. I lit candles and huddled near the fireplace, feeling a coldness that wasn't just from the weather. As I sat alone in the flickering shadows, the footsteps started again. Closer this time, pacing just outside the door. I held my breath. Suddenly the door handle turned slowly. Frozen, I watched as the door creaked open just enough to reveal a figure silhouetted in the doorway. A man in old-fashioned clothes, pale and soaked as if freshly emerged from the sea. His eyes were hollow, his face gaunt but somehow familiar. He stepped inside, his presence chilling the air. Without a word, he turned and pointed toward the lantern room. I swallowed my fear and followed him up the narrow stairs. At the top, he reached out and touched the Fresnel lens. A sudden gust rattled the glass, and the beacon flickered to life, spinning steadily again. The figure turned to me and whispered, "The light must never go out." Then he was gone. I stayed awake until dawn, the sense of his presence lingering like a cold shadow. When the ferry came the next morning, I was ready to leave. I told the Coast Guard I wasn't cut out for lighthouse duty, that the isolation was too much. They just nodded, their faces tight-lipped and knowing. Back on the mainland, I researched the history of East Point Lighthouse and discovered a tragedy I hadn't known about. A keeper named James Harrow, who had disappeared during a terrible storm in the 1920s. Some said he had gone mad, others that he had gone into the sea to save a shipwrecked crew. His body was never found. I couldn't help but feel I had met him. I never returned to the lighthouse. But sometimes late at night, I swear I can hear the sound of the foghorn echoing through the coastal winds and the soft footsteps of a keeper who watches still, making sure the light never fades. Story the end. The fog rolled in thick and fast that autumn evening when I first arrived at the Cedar Point Lighthouse. I'd been hired as a temporary caretaker, a job I thought would be a peaceful break from the city, a quiet month alone on the edge of Maine's rocky coastline. What I didn't expect was how alive the past would feel in that weathered tower, or how much darkness lingered in its shadows. Cedar Point Lighthouse sat on a jagged promontory surrounded by swirling Atlantic waters that crashed relentlessly against the rocks. Built in the late 1800s, it had been automated decades ago, but the Coast Guard still assigned caretakers to maintain the grounds and equipment, especially during storm season. The lighthouse had an imposing presence, whitewashed with a red roof, the glass lantern at the top gleaming like a watchful eye. The cottage where I'd stay was a simple structure just below the tower, weather-beaten and smelling faintly of salt and old wood. Inside were the bare necessities: a stove, a small kitchen, a cot, and an old logbook left behind by previous caretakers. It was isolated, the nearest town nearly 15 miles away and reachable only by a narrow, winding road that skirted the cliffs. I'd always been drawn to lighthouses. There was something haunting and beautiful about their steady light in the dark, a symbol of hope and warning. But Cedar Point was different. From the moment I stepped through the front door, a chill settled into the bones of the place. Not from the cold sea air, but something heavier, an unseen presence. The first few days passed without incident. I spent mornings climbing the spiral staircase to the lantern room, cleaning the lens and checking the foghorn equipment. Afternoons were quiet, with the waves pounding below and seabirds circling overhead. But even in the peaceful moments, I felt watched. One night I was jolted awake by the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside my room. The cottage was old and creaky, but these steps were deliberate, slow and measured, like someone pacing. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door. The hallway was empty. Probably the wind, I told myself. But the footsteps came again the next night, closer this time, echoing up the stairs that led to the tower. I started hearing voices, faint whispers just at the edge of hearing, as if carried on the breeze through the cracks in the walls. Sometimes the foghorn would sound on its own, despite the switch being off. It was unsettling, but I tried to rationalize everything. Old wiring, drafts, the solitude messing with my mind. But then, things escalated. About a week into my stay, I found the door to the tower's lantern room open, even though I was sure I'd locked it. The room was freezing cold, frost forming on the edges of the glass panels. I'd never seen frost inside a building by the sea in autumn. I called the Coast Guard asking for advice. They told me to keep a log of any strange occurrences and that someone would be sent if things got worse. That night, I resolved to stay alert. Around midnight, the foghorn blasted without warning, a deep, haunting wail that seemed to shake the entire island. I stumbled out of bed and raced toward the tower, the cold biting through my clothes. When I reached the lantern room, the horn suddenly stopped and an unnatural silence fell. That's when I saw it. A figure standing in the corner, barely visible through the mist that clung to the glass. It was a man in old-fashioned keeper's clothes, his face pale and eyes hollow. He raised a hand pointing toward the sea. Frozen with fear, I watched as he vanished, the room warming instantly as he disappeared. The next day, I dug through the lighthouse archives and found records of a keeper named James Whitaker, who died in 1923 during a violent storm. According to the reports, Whitaker had gone up to the lantern room during the tempest to keep the light burning, but he never came down. His body was found washed up on the rocks days later. That night, I heard him again. This time, his footsteps echoed in the tower as I climbed the stairs, and his voice whispered my name in the wind. I started to dread the nights, feeling like a guest in my own room. Then the bell started ringing. The lighthouse had a fog bell, a massive, rusted iron bell mounted on a frame near the cliff's edge. It was only supposed to ring during dense fog or storms, but on clear nights it began tolling, slow, deep booms that reverberated through the island. One evening, as I was writing in the logbook, the bell rang 3 times, the just long and mournful. I grabbed my coat and flashlight and walked toward the cliff to see if someone was there. The wind was calm and the fog was absent, but the bell swung back and forth as if struck by an invisible hand. Suddenly, a voice called out from the darkness. Help! The light! I spun around, but the island was empty. Just the crashing waves and the eerie bell tolling on its own. The nights that followed grew worse. I saw the keeper again, sometimes standing at the top of the tower, sometimes at the cliff's edge, always watching the sea, always waiting. One night, I heard the creak of the stairs behind me, but when I turned, no one was there. The cold spots grew colder, like icy fingers brushing against my skin. Shadows flickered at the corners of my vision. I stopped sleeping. On my final night, the wind howled, the sea furious beneath dark skies. The bell tolled endlessly, and the foghorn blasted in wild, erratic bursts. I made my way up the tower, the light swinging wildly in its iron cage. At the top, the figure of James Whittaker appeared again, staring out over the raging ocean. He turned to me, eyes filled with sorrow. The light must never go out. I nodded, understanding what he meant. I spent the storm watching the light, keeping it burning through the darkest hours, feeling his presence beside me, guiding me. When dawn broke, the storm passed, and the island was calm once more. I descended the tower, exhausted but changed. When the relief boat arrived, I left Cedar Point, carrying with me the weight of its history and the memory of a keeper who still guarded his post from beyond the grave. To this day, whenever I hear the distant toll of a fog bell or see a lighthouse standing firm against the sea, I think of James Whittaker, the man who never left his light unattended. Story the end. The sea was angry the day I arrived at Windward Point Lighthouse, a small, weather-beaten tower standing sentinel on the rocky coast of Maine. The sky was a bruised gray, heavy with salt and storm, and the wind howled like a banshee through the pines that lined the narrow road. I had taken the job as the lighthouse keeper, partly out of necessity, partly because I was chasing a quiet reprieve after years spent in the Navy. The job was simple, they said. Keep the light burning, maintain the equipment, make sure the foghorn sounded when the weather turned sour. It sounded peaceful, almost idyllic, but I was about to learn just how deceptive calm could be. My first week went by without incident. I familiarized myself with the lighthouse, the generator, the old oil lamp mechanism that had been converted to electricity decades ago but still needed regular maintenance. The local townspeople were cordial but reserved. They told stories, old legends about Windward Point, but always with a serious tone that made me think they weren't joking. The most common tale was about the original keeper, Thomas Whitmore, who vanished one stormy night nearly 100 years ago. The official report said he fell into the sea while trying to light the beacon, but no body was ever found. Locals claimed his spirit lingered, still trying to keep the light alive. I was skeptical. Ghost stories were for tourists or lonely sailors. I had my hands full just keeping the equipment running and handling the relentless weather. On the 8th night, just as I was settling down after dinner, I heard a faint tapping on the window of the keeper's cottage. The fog outside was thick, swallowing up the sound of the crashing waves. The tapping came again, 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I went to the window, heart pounding, but there was nothing visible beyond the mist. No figure, no boat, no sign of life. I told myself it was probably a branch knocked loose by the wind. But then came footsteps. Heavy, wet footsteps crunching on the gravel outside. I grabbed the flashlight and swung the door open, but the yard was empty, the fog dense and suffocating. The footsteps faded away toward the lighthouse. Curious and uneasy, I followed the sound, climbing the narrow spiral staircase inside the tower. The metal steps were slick with moisture. Halfway up, the footsteps stopped. I called out, but only my own echo answered me. That night, sleep was a stranger. The foghorn's mournful cry was joined by a low, indistinct whispering that seemed to drift from the lighthouse itself. I dismissed it as the wind playing tricks, but the feeling of being watched settled in my bones. The next day, I found wet footprints on the balcony outside the lamp room, barefoot, large and trailing toward the railing that overlooked the sea. No footprints led away from the balcony. It was as if someone had vanished into the air. I cleaned the footprints away, but they returned the following night. On the 10th night, the light flickered and died just after midnight. The generator sputtered, leaving the tower in darkness except for the pale moonlight. I scrambled to restart it, but as I worked, a shape appeared on the balcony. A man in an old oilskin coat, soaked and dripping, staring out to sea. His eyes were hollow pits of black, and his face was gaunt and pale. I froze, unable to look away. He raised a trembling hand and pointed out over the water. Suddenly, the fog shifted, revealing a fishing boat caught in the waves, its own light flickering and going dark. I fumbled to restart the lighthouse light, and as the beacon flared back to life, the fishing boat's lights returned. The figure on the balcony smiled faintly, then disappeared into the mist. After that night, the footsteps stopped. The whispering ceased. The light never faltered again. I left Windward Point with the knowledge that some spirits linger for a purpose, and sometimes they need help to find peace. Story the end. The fog had rolled in thick that evening, smothering the jagged Maine coastline like wet cotton. I had just taken over the temporary lighthouse keeper post at Rook's Point, a craggy outcrop about 6 miles from the nearest town, Branford. The town didn't have much, an old bait shop, a diner that only served breakfast, and a post office that looked like it had been abandoned since the 1960s. But that didn't matter. I wasn't there for the town. I was there because the previous keeper had gone missing. His name was Ellis Rayburn. 62, retired Navy, divorced, no kids. He'd manned Rook's Point for the last 6 years with no problems. Then, about 3 weeks before I arrived, the Coast Guard got a panicked call from him in the middle of the night. They said he was shouting about someone walking around the cliffs right outside the keeper's quarters. But when they sent a team up the next morning, they didn't find anyone, just the lamp running unattended and the door wide open. Ellis was gone. They searched for days, helicopters, dogs, the whole deal. But the weather had been nasty, and everyone figured he must have slipped and fallen into the rocks. Still, no body ever turned up, and in a place like that, you usually find something. I didn't ask too many questions when they offered me the post. I'd worked a few other lighthouses, mostly on the Great Lakes, once in Oregon, but nothing this isolated. The pay was good, and they needed someone fast. I figured I'd stay a month, maybe 2, and move on. My first night there was uneventful. The light was automated, but someone still had to do checks, keep logs, make sure the signal was running properly. The keeper's quarters were small, a bedroom, a kitchenette, a radio room, and the staircase leading up into the main tower. The wind howled all night, and I barely slept. But that was just nerves. The second night, though, things started to change. It was just after midnight when I first heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, pacing back and forth on the gravel outside. I was in bed reading, but the sound carried through the walls like a whisper. I turned off the lamp and listened, heart beating a little too fast. The wind had died down, and the only other sound was the distant crash of waves against the rocks. I moved to the window and pulled the curtain aside. Fog blanketed everything. I could barely see the stairs leading up to the tower, but the sound of the footsteps continued, gravel crunching underfoot, pacing in a tight circle like someone waiting. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped outside, calling out, "Hello? Coast Guard?" No answer. I walked toward the tower and swept the beam of light around. Nothing, just the fog and the echo of the waves. The footsteps had stopped. I stood there for a long time, listening before heading back in. By the time I made it to the bed, the footsteps had started again. I didn't sleep at all that night. Over the next few days, I tried to explain it away. Maybe the wind was playing tricks. Maybe animals were knocking loose gravel around. I checked the security cams, but they were mostly junk, old and water damaged. Only one even worked properly, and it was pointed toward the cliff. But it wasn't just the footsteps. One night I was up late, filing logs in the radio room, when I heard something upstairs, inside the tower. At first, it was just a soft scuff, like someone moving on the metal stairs. Then came the loud clang, like a boot heel stomping on iron. I froze. No one should have been up there. I hadn't gone into the tower all day. The place was locked. I grabbed the flashlight and crept up the stairs. The metal was cold under my feet, the air inside damp with salt and rust. Each step echoed up the narrow shaft. I reached the landing beneath the lamp room and stopped. The door was open. It had been locked. I was sure of it. I'd checked it that morning. I stepped inside. The lamp turned slowly above me, throwing long beams of light through the thick glass windows, illuminating the swirling fog outside. The room was empty. I checked every corner. No one. But just before I turned to leave, I caught a shape in the fog. A figure, tall and still, standing just beyond the railing on the outer deck. It stood motionless as the beam passed over it. I stepped closer to the glass, trying to see more, but the fog swallowed the figure almost immediately. When the light swung around again, it was gone. I didn't sleep that night either. A few days later, I drove into Branford to stock up on supplies and talk to the woman at the diner. Her name was Janine, late 50s, wiry, sharp eyes. She had that way about her, like she'd seen a lot, but didn't talk about most of it. I asked if she'd ever known Ellis Rayburn. She gave a short nod. Kept to himself. Said the tower gave him peace. What about before him? I asked. Anyone else ever disappear out there? Janine didn't answer right away. She poured coffee into my mug, then said, "Old places like that, they carry things. I don't know if you believe in ghosts or not, but Rook's Point has a bad history." What kind of history? She looked around the diner, lowered her voice. Back in 1911, there was a keeper named Mason Thorne. They say he went mad, killed his assistant with an axe, dragged the body up to the lamp room, and jumped from the deck into the rocks. They never found either body, just blood everywhere. I stared at her. That really happened? She shrugged. Some folks say the sea takes what it wants, but others think the lighthouse itself, it's cursed. I didn't know what to say. I thanked her, paid, and left. But that night, I dreamed of a man's face, bearded, wide-eyed, mouth twisted into a scream, and woke up gasping for air. The worst night came about a week later. It was just after 2 a.m. I was in the radio room when the signal monitor spiked, an alert I'd never seen before. The light was out. That shouldn't have happened. The lamp was automated, built to resist even the worst storms. I grabbed my coat and rushed out into the night. The fog was thicker than ever. I could barely see a few feet ahead. As I climbed the tower, my flashlight flickered and died. When I reached the top, the air felt different, heavier, like I was underwater. The lamp wasn't just out. The power was dead. The room was pitch black, the fog pressing against the glass like a living thing. Then I heard it. Breathing. Not mine. It came from behind me, in the darkness of the room. Slow, ragged breaths, wet and strained. I spun around, heart hammering. There was no one there. I backed toward the stairs when a shape passed by the window outside. Human, unmistakably tall. Then another. And another. They moved slowly around the deck, one after the other, as if in procession. I felt the room drop in temperature. Then came the whisper. Leave. It wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It was tired. Sad, like someone who'd been waiting too long. I stumbled down the stairs, barely able to breathe. The metal groaned beneath me, but the groaning didn't stop when I did. It echoed like footsteps following behind. I made it back to the quarters and slammed the door. Locked it. Barricaded it. Barricaded it. I didn't sleep. I didn't even sit down. I just waited until dawn. The light came back on by itself sometime around 5 a.m. The systems reset, no errors on the monitor. I checked the breakers, the wiring, everything was intact. No sign of power failure. No rational explanation. After that, I called the regional coordinator and told him I was resigning. He didn't sound surprised, just said, "Understood. We'll send someone else up to take over." I left that same day. It's been 2 years since I worked Rook's Point. I've taken other jobs, ones closer to town with other people nearby, but I still think about that place. Sometimes I dream about it. Sometimes when I walk alone at night, I hear footsteps behind me on gravel. I never look, because I know if I do, I'll see someone standing in the fog just waiting. Story the end. The first time I saw the Markham Point Lighthouse, it was an overcast autumn afternoon in late October. The sky was a patchwork of gray clouds, low enough to almost touch the rocky cliffs beneath the lighthouse. I was working for a small local historical preservation society in Maine, temporarily hired to catalog and maintain some of the old lighthouses along the coast. Markham Point was one of the more isolated ones, perched precariously on a jutting rock formation nearly a mile offshore, reachable only by a small boat that departed at dawn and returned just before dusk. It was the kind of place people usually told stories about, stories of storms, shipwrecks, and ghosts. I didn't believe much in the supernatural at the time. To me, the lighthouse was just a weathered sentinel, standing guard against the Atlantic's fury, a piece of history that had to be preserved before time and neglect took it all away. But what I experienced over the 6 weeks I spent there changed everything. The job was straightforward. I was to live in the keeper's quarters attached to the lighthouse, check the machinery, clean the glass, maintain the logs, and generally ensure the beacon remained functional until the end of the season. There was electricity, but it came from a small generator, and phone and internet were non-existent. I had only myself for company, the wind, the waves, the seagulls, and, as I would come to learn, something else. The first few days were almost peaceful. I settled into the routine of climbing the spiral staircase, checking the Fresnel lens, polishing the brass fittings, and recording weather data. The sun rose over the horizon like a molten gold orb, and the sea sparkled under the gentle light. The keeper's log from previous years was stacked in a cabinet. I leafed through it in the evenings by kerosene lamp, reading entries about fog, storms, and lonely nights. Then the knocking began. It was subtle at first, barely audible over the wind's howl. On the fifth night, just after midnight, I was jolted awake by 3 sharp knocks at the heavy wooden door leading into the tower. I sat upright, heart racing, and called out. No answer. The fog had rolled in thick, cloaking the rocks and the sea in a white shroud. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the door. Nothing but the echo of the knocks fading into the wind. I told myself it was the storm or the old building settling. But it came again the next night, and the next. 3 knocks, always at midnight, deliberate and slow, like a message. I began to keep notes, jotting down the time, weather, and any unusual details. The knocking was never accompanied by any sign of a person or animal. No footprints in the dust, no movement on the shore, only the knocking. One evening, I found a worn journal tucked beneath the floorboards in the lighthouse's base. It belonged to Thomas Grayson, a keeper from the early 1900s. His handwriting was neat but hurried. The entries spoke of loneliness, of storms that battered the lighthouse and ships lost to the sea. But one entry chilled me. October 18th, 1912. Heard the knocks again last night. 3 sharp knocks at midnight. No wind, no storm. I looked outside, but the rocks were bare. I fear something watches from the shadows. I'm not alone. There was more, but the pages were stained and torn. The last legible entry was dated October 23rd, 1912. That same night, I dreamed of a woman standing on the rocks below the lighthouse. She wore a long white dress, her hair tangled by the wind, eyes full of sorrow. She reached out to me silently, her pale face illuminated by the faint glow of the beacon above. When I woke, my heart was pounding. The knocking had stopped. For 2 nights, there was silence. Then, on the 3rd night, the lantern light faltered. The motor stuttered and died. I scrambled up the stairs in the dark, wrench in hand, to fix it. As I entered the lantern room, I felt a sudden chill, the temperature dropping so fast I could see my breath. The glass walls were slick with moisture, but no rain had fallen. And standing just outside the glass, her eyes wide and empty, was the woman from my dream. She didn't speak, didn't move, just watched me with an unearthly stillness. I stumbled back, my flashlight shaking, and the light flickered back to life. I haven't been able to explain what I saw that night. The remaining weeks passed in a blur. The knocking returned, but less insistently. Sometimes late at night, I heard footsteps echoing on the stairs, soft and wet, though no one was there. My food supplies dwindled faster than I could account for, as if something unseen was sharing my quarters. On the last day, as I packed up to leave, I found a small wooden box hidden beneath the floorboards where I'd found the journal. Inside was a faded photograph of a woman in a white dress standing at the base of the lighthouse, staring out at the sea. The back was inscribed, Eleanor, lost at sea, October 22nd, 1912. I never saw her again after that, but sometimes when the fog rolls in thick on the coast and the wind carries a distant knocking, I swear I hear her calling. Story the end. It was the summer of 1997 when I first got the job as a maintenance assistant at Spruce Point Lighthouse, a remote beacon off the coast of Maine. I just turned 23, restless, with no real direction, and figured a few months of solitude might give me the clarity I needed. The lighthouse sat on a rocky peninsula, surrounded by nothing but sharp cliffs, cold Atlantic water, and fog that could choke your breath. The main tower was nearly a century old, whitewashed, narrow, and scarred with rust near the iron railings. Attached to it was a 2-room keeper's cottage, old but livable. There was no road in, just a rough trail inland or access by boat from the tiny harbor town of Mariner's Rest. The lighthouse hadn't had a full-time keeper since the 80s, but it still functioned as a navigational aid. My role was simple: maintain the light, monitor the backup systems, and check in weekly with the local Coast Guard station. It paid better than most of the jobs I'd had, and besides, I needed the isolation. The first week was uneventful. The air was crisp, mornings greeted me with thick fog and the distant wail of foghorns. At night, the beacon flashed in rhythmic pulses, a mechanical heartbeat echoing into the ocean. The only sounds were the wind, the surf, and the occasional gull. I spent most of my time repairing loose floorboards, recalking windows, and cataloging old logs left behind by former keepers. Some of those entries went back to the 1940s, yellowed and cracked with age. There were dozens of mentions of a Maureen throughout the years, often described with reverence or sympathy. I assumed she was the wife or daughter of an old keeper, maybe someone who had passed away. On the 9th day, I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps above me. The cottage had no second floor. It was the kind of sound you couldn't dismiss as imagination, the distinct, slow pacing of boots on wood. I grabbed my flashlight, stepped outside, and shined the beam upward toward the narrow balcony that ringed the top of the tower. There was no one. The next morning, I found wet footprints on the spiral stairs inside the lighthouse. They led up from the ground floor and disappeared near the lantern room. They were small, barefoot, and they shouldn't have been there, especially since I always locked the main door. There was no sign of a break-in, and nothing was missing. I checked the logbook out of habit and noticed an old faded entry that said, "Footsteps again, Maureen restless, tried playing the record, didn't help." It was dated October 1953. That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak and shift in the woods sent my pulse spiking. I decided not to tell the Coast Guard. Who would believe me? I told myself it was just the age of the place, sea moisture warping the floors, and the isolation messing with my head. Things escalated by the third week. I was sitting in the kitchen one evening, listening to a cassette of an old jazz radio show I'd recorded off the air, when I heard a soft humming from the next room. It was faint, feminine, and tuneless. I froze. The cassette stopped. The humming continued. I stood and walked slowly into the bedroom. No one was there. The window was open, but I hadn't opened it. That night, I dreamed of drowning. I saw a young woman in a white dress standing on the edge of the cliff behind the lighthouse. Her skin was pale, almost gray, and her eyes were solid black. She didn't speak, but I felt her sadness like a weight in my chest. When I woke, my sheets were soaked with sweat, and the bedroom window was open again. I tried leaving the next day. I packed a bag and hiked the mile-long trail back toward the road. But halfway there, I tripped. Not over a rock or a root. I tripped over nothing. I fell so hard I cracked a rib and scraped my palms raw. As I sat up, wheezing and clutching my side, I looked behind me and saw wet footprints leading back in the direction of the lighthouse. I hadn't stepped in water. I turned around and limped back. I didn't call for help. I didn't know what to say. I convinced myself it was an accident, a coincidence. I had to finish the job just a few more weeks. I could do it. I kept telling myself that. But Maureen didn't want me to leave. Every night the footsteps returned. Sometimes I would see the silhouette of a woman in the lantern room when I stood outside. Sometimes I would hear sobbing near the rocks, always just out of sight. The fog would thicken unnaturally, to the point where even the lighthouse's powerful beams seemed to dissolve into it. Once, I woke to the sound of scratching at the front door as though fingernails were clawing at the wood. When I opened it, no one was there, but the claw marks were. I became obsessed with the old logbooks. I went through them one by one, looking for answers. I found mentions of Maureen scattered over decades. She was never listed as a keeper or official resident. But every few years, entries would mention her name. Maureen cried again last night. Something's keeping her here. She was on the rocks again. Tried to talk to her. She vanished. Wind won't blow the fog off when she's near. Lighthouse feels cold even with the fire burning. Then I found a newspaper clipping, yellowed and folded into the back of one of the books. It was dated 1933. Young woman missing from Spruce Point. The article described a local girl named Maureen Callahan who had vanished during a storm. She was believed to have jumped from the cliffs after a fight with her fiancé, a lighthouse keeper named Thomas Graves. Her body was never found. There was a photo, grainy and dark, but the face was unmistakable. It was the woman from my dream. The same black eyes, the same white dress. The next few nights blurred together. Time lost meaning. The generator failed multiple times, even after I'd replaced every component. Batteries drained overnight. I stopped sleeping more than an hour or two at a time. I saw her more often now, sometimes in the reflection of the glass door, sometimes standing just beyond the fog. Once, I found seaweed in the kitchen sink. Another time, water pooled in the hallway, though nothing had leaked. I spoke to her once. I begged her to leave me alone. All she did was hum. The storm came in early September, sudden and violent. Wind ripped through the trees, waves crashed over the rocks. I climbed the tower to check on the beacon and found the door to the lantern room open. I never left it open. Inside, Maureen stood at the window. Her dress clung to her like wet cloth, her hair dripping. She didn't turn to look at me. I felt my throat close up. The air was freezing, yet I was sweating. I asked her what she wanted. She lifted one arm and pointed out the window toward the cliffs. I looked. Down there, and amid the crashing waves, was something I hadn't seen before. A twisted iron railing, half buried in rock and moss. As I stared, a gust of wind shoved me hard against the glass. When I turned back, she was gone. I waited out the storm, then went down to the rocks. It took hours, but I found what she wanted me to see. Behind the crumbling iron, hidden beneath tangled vines, was a small stone marker, half eroded. The name was barely legible, Maureen Callahan, 1910 to 1933. The death year had been carved later by hand. Someone had made her a grave, but kept it hidden. Maybe her fiancé, out of guilt or shame. I don't know what made me do it. I spent the rest of the day cleaning the site. I cleared the vines, rebuilt the marker with stones, and carved her name again with my knife. I even brought some flowers from inland the next day. After that, the humming stopped. The fog lifted for the first time in weeks. The tower felt warmer. I finished the season. No more dreams, no more footsteps, just wind and waves. I didn't go back the following year. I passed the job off to another guy, and I never told him about Maureen. I didn't have to. He quit 2 weeks in, said he couldn't sleep, said he heard humming. Story the end. The first time I was called out to the Crow's Nest Lighthouse was in late October of 1982. I was 23, fresh out of the Coast Guard, working as a maintenance technician for the Department of Homeland Security's Lighthouse Division. My job was to perform routine inspections and repairs on remote automated lighthouses along the northeastern coast, places that hadn't had a live keeper in decades, but still needed a human eye now and then. Crow's Nest was different from the others, though. The locals all talked about it in hushed tones, half joking, half serious. Some said it was haunted. Others warned me not to linger after dark. Being young and a bit skeptical, I figured it was just stories to keep tourists interested. The truth, I found out, was far more unsettling. Getting to Crow's Nest was an ordeal. The lighthouse sat on a tiny rocky island, roughly 2 miles off the coast of Cape Cod. The island was just big enough for the White Tower and the abandoned keeper's quarters. No trees, no real shelter, just jagged rocks and the endless Atlantic waves. I arrived by boat just before sundown. The sky was heavy with gray clouds, and a chill wind whipped up the sea spray. As I stepped onto the cracked concrete dock, I noticed how the lighthouse stood stark and alone against the gathering dusk. The windows of the keeper's house were boarded up, the paint peeling, the whole place giving off an air of neglect and melancholy. Inside, the automated light was working fine, blinking steadily from its lantern room atop the tower. The electronics hummed in the basement, powered by solar panels that looked like they'd seen better days. My job was to check everything, clean the panels, run diagnostics on the beacon, and make sure the backup generator was ready for winter. The first night passed without incident. I slept in the old keeper's house despite warnings from my supervisor to stay in the mainland cabin whenever possible. I wanted to experience the place for myself, to see what stories it held. Around midnight, I woke to a faint tapping sound coming from the direction of the tower. I sat up and listened. Tap, 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 slow, rhythmic. It wasn't the wind. The night was still. Curious, I grabbed my flashlight and headed outside. The moon was hidden behind clouds, and the island was bathed in an eerie darkness. The tapping continued, coming from the base of the lighthouse. I circled the tower, shining the beam around the rocks. Nothing. No animals, no people. When I looked up at the lantern room window, the glass was streaked with something, mud or grime, but in the beam of my light I thought I saw a shadow move. A figure, perhaps, standing just inside. I called out softly, but no answer. I went back inside and locked the door, my heart pounding. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was a trick of light and fatigue. The following days grew stranger. The supply boat was late arriving, and the weather worsened. I heard footsteps in the attic, whispers drifting through the cracked walls. One morning, I found the radio logbook open to a page dated 1953 with a note scribbled in shaky handwriting. "Can't keep the light burning. She watches. I fear for my soul." That night, the knocking returned, louder, more insistent. I turned on every light, pointed my radio toward the static, and waited. Suddenly, a cold gust blew through the room, extinguishing my lantern. The radio hissed and then emitted a voice, a woman's voice, faint and broken, pleading, "Help me. Keep the light." The temperature dropped so suddenly I could see my breath. A mist formed inside the room, swirling into a vague shape. A woman in a long white dress, hair flowing, eyes hollow. I wanted to run, but my legs felt frozen. She raised a pale hand toward the window, pointing out to sea. The voice whispered again, "The light must never go out." When dawn broke, the apparition was gone. I called the Coast Guard and requested immediate extraction. Back on the mainland, I learned the story of Eleanor, the keeper's wife who died in a storm trying to keep the light burning during a blackout in 1953. The lighthouse had been automated shortly after. I never returned to Crow's Nest, but every now and then, when the fog rolls in thick and the night is silent, I swear I hear tapping and the faint voice of Eleanor, begging someone to keep the light alive. Story the end. The wind had teeth that night. It bit through the seams of my jacket and rattled the shutters of the old lighthouse like someone was trying to get in. I stood on the wraparound porch with my arms crossed, watching the angry Atlantic crash against the rocky shoreline, each wave striking with the fury of a war drum. My flashlight flickered in my hand. Batteries weak, or something else. The radio inside crackled with static, no voice, no weather updates, just an eerie hiss. I had taken the job because I needed the silence. After 10 years of working emergency dispatch in Philadelphia, I wanted quiet. I wanted something that didn't scream in my ears at 2 a.m. I thought a month at Penobscot Lighthouse off the coast of Maine would be a kind of peace. It was just me, the sea, and the light. No people, no emergencies, no ghosts. At least that's what I told myself. The lighthouse had been automated for decades, but the Coast Guard still required occasional manned checks, especially after storms. I was a temp replacement for a guy named Vern who had slipped on some ice and broken his collarbone. The government contract came through a buddy I had in the Park Service, and within a week I was ferried out to the island with enough food and gear for a month. The keeper's quarters were attached to the tower, old, creaky, but sturdy. The light itself still worked like clockwork, powered by a sealed solar system and a backup diesel generator in the shed. My job was simple: maintain equipment, log weather and sea conditions, and make sure the beacon kept turning. It was the second week when things started to feel off. It began with footsteps. I was asleep in the second-floor bedroom when I heard them. Slow, deliberate steps across the hardwood floor downstairs. I jolted awake, heart hammering. The kind of full-body alertness you don't forget from years of hearing real panic through a headset. I reached for the flashlight I kept next to the bed, but it wouldn't turn on. Batteries were fine earlier. I listened again. Nothing. I made my way downstairs barefoot, the wood ice-cold beneath my feet. The kitchen was empty. Living room too. The front door was still locked from the inside, and the deadbolt was still set. I looked around for signs of animals. Maybe a raccoon had gotten in, but everything was undisturbed. Still, I didn't sleep much that night. The next day I told myself it was the house settling. Old buildings make noise. The kind of logic that sounds reasonable in daylight. I focused on my chores, checking the diesel levels, cleaning salt buildup from the lens, logging wave height and wind speed. The air was heavy that day, the clouds swollen with something unspoken. The gulls didn't come around like they usually did. I didn't hear a single bird. That night, the footsteps came again, and this time they stopped outside my bedroom door. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. The hallway was pitch black. I stared at the door from my bed, watching the shadow under it, waiting for movement. Nothing. Then I heard the knob turn. It didn't open. It just turned, slow and smooth, like someone was testing it. I waited until morning to open that door. The hallway was empty. But on the floor, just in front of the door frame, was a small puddle of water. No rain, no leaks. Just seawater pooled there like someone had stood dripping outside my room for hours. I started keeping a log of everything. Not the official weather log, a private one. Each night brought something new. The temperature would plummet suddenly in one room, then return to normal. The radio would emit a garbled voice that sounded like it was trying to speak through a mouthful of salt water. The flashlight batteries would drain within hours, even when brand new. And always the footsteps. Never running. Just walking. Pacing. I began leaving the bedroom light on and the door wedged shut with a chair. It didn't matter. I'd hear the chair scrape in the night, and once I found it moved 3 feet down the hall when I woke up. By the third week, I was fraying. My hands shook when I tried to log temperatures. I flinched at every sound. I started talking aloud just to break the silence. I needed to believe I was still alone, still in control. It was around then that I found the notebook. I was cleaning the basement where the oil drums and electrical panels were when I knocked over an old crate. Inside were some tools, rusted, and a weather-worn leather journal. The spine was cracked, and the first page was signed. Vern Holt, February 1994. Vern, the guy I was replacing. The entries started off mundane, like mine, wind speeds, barometric pressure, fish sightings. But then, slowly, the tone shifted. Heard someone talking near the lens room last night. Thought maybe it was the radio. Wasn't. Saw a figure at the edge of the cliffs. Went to check. No one there. Something's wrong with the light. Keeps slowing, then speeds up. I checked the motor. No issues. Doesn't feel mechanical. Then, an entry dated 2 days before his log stopped entirely. I saw him again. In the tower this time. He looked like me. Not kind of like me. Exactly like me. Staring at me from the other side of the lens. I slammed the journal shut. My hands were sweating. I sat there in the basement with the old oil drums and shadows too deep for comfort, trying to convince myself it was a prank. Maybe Vern lost his mind. Maybe I was. That night, the beacon stopped spinning. I climbed the tower to check, flashlight trembling in my hand. The narrow metal stairs groaned beneath me. I had the radio clipped to my belt, but it was dead, even though it had been charging all day. When I reached the top, the room felt wrong. The air was thicker. The salt in it stung my eyes. The motor that powered the beacon was off, but not broken. No burned wires, no corrosion. It had just stopped. I turned it manually, trying to get it moving again. As I did, something moved in the reflection of the lens. At first, I thought it was my own image, distorted by the glass. But it blinked, out of sync with me. Then it smiled. I stumbled backward and hit the rail. My body nearly went over before I caught myself. When I looked again, the figure was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed in the kitchen with every light on. The wind howled louder than usual, and more than once I heard banging from upstairs, like something throwing itself against the bedroom walls. Morning brought no relief. I sent a message via satellite tablet to the Coast Guard, requesting immediate pickup. Said I was sick. Said there was equipment failure. I didn't care. I just needed off the island. They responded 12 hours later. Storms in the area, no pickup for at least 3 more days. I started boarding up the bedroom at night. I didn't even try to sleep anymore. I sat at the table, flashlight in one hand, crowbar in the other. I watched the door. I watched the windows. The second night after my request, the power went out. The generator wouldn't turn on, no matter how many times I pulled the cord. The house went black. The cold moved in like a living thing, and the footsteps came again. But this time, they came down the stairs. I heard the creak of each step, one by one. I held my breath. I didn't want to see it, whatever it was. My heart was hammering so loud I couldn't hear anything else. Then the footsteps stopped just outside the kitchen. I aimed the flashlight at the door, but it wouldn't turn on. I fumbled for matches. My hand was shaking so hard I dropped them. When I finally lit one, the flare illuminated the room in a trembling orange glow. There was no one at the door, but there were wet footprints across the floor. They led to the kitchen table, to the chair across from mine. And then the chair pulled out. I ran. I don't remember making the decision. I just remember my legs moving. I flew out the door into the cold night. The wind slammed into me like a wall, and the rain had started again, slicing through my clothes. I ran to the tower. I didn't know why. Maybe I thought the light could protect me. Maybe I was too scared to go anywhere else. I climbed the stairs, panting, soaking, barely able to hold onto the rail. When I reached the top, the lens room was dark. But I wasn't alone. He was standing by the glass. He looked just like me. Same face, same soaked jacket. But his eyes were wrong. They were too dark, too empty. He raised one hand slowly and pressed it to the glass. I backed away, whispering prayers I hadn't said in years. He didn't move, just stared. And then, without sound, he mouthed something. "You're the light now." I blacked out. I woke up on the floor of the tower. The light was spinning again. The sun was up. My clothes were dry. The footprints were gone. 3 days later, the Coast Guard arrived. They found me sitting on the edge of the cliff, staring at the sea. I didn't speak much. I just kept repeating the same sentence. "Don't leave the light alone." I was flown back to the mainland. The official report blamed isolation stress, hallucinations brought on by exhaustion and vitamin deficiency. I didn't argue. I never went back. A few years later, I heard a story from another temp worker. Different guy, different year. He stayed on the island for 2 weeks, left early, wouldn't talk about it, said the lens reflected things it shouldn't. And now, when I close my eyes at night, I sometimes see the lens again, and someone standing behind it. Someone that looks just like me, waiting. Story the end. In the fall of 1987, I was hired by the U.S. Coast Guard to assist in the upkeep and maintenance of a decommissioned lighthouse just off the coast of Maine. The place was called Whitlock Point, a rocky outcrop about a mile from the mainland, reachable only by boat or, in extreme low tide, a treacherous walk across sharp, slippery stones. The tower had been shut down officially in 1974, but there was still enough maritime activity nearby that the government decided to preserve the structure as a historical site and weather monitoring station. I was 27, between jobs, and desperate for something that paid steady. The position came with housing in the adjacent keeper's quarters, a stipend, and solitude, something I thought I craved at the time. I was told I'd be living alone on the island for 30-day shifts, then get a week off on the mainland before returning. There was a radio and backup generator, some emergency supplies, and a rotation schedule for supply drops every 2 weeks by a small contracted boat. I arrived in early October. The wind had picked up by the time the small tugboat dropped me off at the dock, and the 2 men piloting it didn't stick around long. One of them, an older guy with a hard face and graying beard, said something odd as he helped me lift my duffel bag. "If you hear the bell ring at night, don't go outside," he said, his voice just loud enough to cut through the wind. I laughed, thinking it was a joke, but he didn't smile. They were gone before I could ask him what he meant. The lighthouse was beautiful in a grim sort of way. Salt-streaked stone tower, rusted iron stairwell winding up its center, and the old Fresnel lens still perched in the lantern room at the top. The keeper's house was in decent shape. Wood stove, working plumbing, and enough canned food to last a nuclear winter. I settled in quickly, eager to spend some quiet time reading and writing, maybe even getting my thoughts straight about where I wanted life to go. The first few days were uneventful, peaceful even. Gulls circled overhead during the day, waves crashed steadily along the jagged rocks, and at night the foghorn moaned low and far away, coming from a buoy half a mile out. I listened to it like a lullaby. The days were spent doing minor maintenance and checking the weather instruments. I even climbed the tower every morning just to sit in the lantern room and watch the sun come up. But around the end of the first week, strange things began to happen. It started with the footsteps. The keeper's house had old wooden floors that creaked loudly, so when I heard the sound of someone walking in the hallway outside my bedroom in the middle of the night, I assumed it must be the wood settling or maybe my own imagination playing tricks. But these were distinct steps, measured, deliberate, and far too rhythmic to be natural. I got up quickly and checked the hall. Nothing. Just the dark stretch of narrow floorboards and the faint smell of seawater that always seemed to cling to the place. I told myself it must have been a dream and went back to bed. The next night, the same thing happened. and the next. I started sleeping with a flashlight under my pillow. I never caught anything in the act, never saw anything out of place, but the feeling grew, an awareness like something was watching me from the dark corners of the house. It didn't help that the radio sometimes crackled to life with faint static, even when turned off. One night, it blurted out a burst of old-time music, a scratchy waltz like from a gramophone, then died again. That was the same night I first heard the bell. It rang at 2:17 a.m., not the fog bell from the buoy. This was something much closer, a loud, slow clang that echoed off the walls of the house and sent a vibration through the floors. I jumped out of bed, heart hammering, and ran outside in my socks and thermal shirt. The wind was still. The sea was calm. There was no fog. But the bell, mounted on a long-forgotten structure near the edge of the cliff, was swaying gently, its rusted iron mouth still quivering from the strike. I hadn't even known it was there. It wasn't listed in the manual I was given, nor was it mentioned during my orientation. I hadn't noticed it during my walkarounds, but there it stood, an old ship's bell, mounted on a weather-beaten frame near the path that led to the back of the island. I walked over, hands trembling, and studied it under the moonlight. The metal was badly oxidized, greenish-blue with streaks of rust. There was no wind to explain the movement. That night I didn't sleep. The next morning I took a walk along the island's perimeter, trying to clear my head. About 100 yards from the bell, in a small clearing behind the lighthouse, I found a strange patch of ground. It was sunken slightly, a shallow depression in the shape of a rectangle. The grass there was yellowed and thin, as if it had trouble growing. Something about it felt wrong. I left it alone and tried not to think too much about it. The following week, I started hearing voices. They weren't clear, more like murmurs. Sometimes they came from the tower, sometimes from the yard, and once I swore I heard someone humming a tune right outside the kitchen window. I bolted outside with my flashlight and knife, thinking someone might be messing with me, maybe one of the locals having a laugh. But there was no one there, just sea spray and darkness. I radioed the supply boat and asked if they could come a few days early. The dispatcher hesitated before saying they'd try, but couldn't promise anything. Weather was bad on the mainland, high winds predicted. I'd have to wait at least another 4 days. On the third night after the bell, I was woken up by a loud thud upstairs. Not a creak or step. This was something falling. I rushed up into the tower, half asleep, flashlight cutting through the pitch. The spiral staircase groaned under my feet. When I reached the lantern room, I found a pile of old tools scattered across the floor. A heavy wrench had rolled to the edge of the glass, inches from smashing through. The tools weren't mine. I hadn't touched anything up there. Something had opened the maintenance cabinet, which had been locked. I started keeping a journal. Writing everything down seemed like the only way to stay grounded. Every noise, every voice, every unexplained cold draft. I documented it, hoping to make sense of the timeline. What stood out most was the pattern. The voices grew louder near the bell. The air got colder the closer I stood to that sunken patch behind the lighthouse. Then I saw him. It was the final night before my pickup. The wind was howling, rain coming in sideways. I was sitting in the kitchen, lights off, stove going. The lantern beside me cast a dim circle of yellow when something moved outside the window. A flash of white, just a second, but enough to freeze me solid. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped toward the door, heart pounding like a drum. The figure was standing at the edge of the yard, near the bell. A man. Thin, wearing an old oilskin coat, the kind mariners used in the 1800s. His face was pale, eyes sunk deep into shadow sockets. He didn't move, just stared up at the tower, not at me. I shouted. He didn't flinch. I flicked the beam of the flashlight toward him, and the light passed right through, not around, through like he was fog. Then he vanished. I ran back inside, bolted the door, and waited with the shotgun from the emergency locker, knowing full well it wouldn't do any good. I didn't sleep, didn't blink. When the sun rose, I stumbled outside and saw footprints, wet and fresh, leading from the bell to the edge of the cliff. But there were no prints coming back. When the boat arrived that afternoon, I told them everything. The younger man laughed it off. The older one didn't. He looked at me and said, "You saw him, didn't you?" I nodded. He nodded back. That was Benjamin Rowe, keeper in 1913. Died during a storm. They never recovered his body. Some say he still rings the bell when the weather's turning or when he thinks someone else is about to die out here. I transferred out the next week, never went back. Heard from someone later that they closed the lighthouse for good a few years after. Said it was unsafe. Maybe it was, but not in the way they think. I still dream of the bell. It always rings at 2:17. Story the end. The fog had settled in thick over the rocky coast of Maine that afternoon, rolling in slow and low, clinging to the ground like something alive. It crept over the cliffs and into the cracks of the lighthouse foundation, smothering the sea with a damp hush. The kind of fog that made sound feel thinner, like it could be swallowed whole. By the time Dennis Rourke arrived at the old Beacon Point Lighthouse for his first overnight shift as the new keeper, the whole peninsula felt sealed off from the world. He'd taken the job after quitting his work with the ferry service out of Bar Harbor. He needed something quieter, something slower. His doctor had used the word hypertension, but Dennis knew the truth. He was tired of people, tired of noise. The lighthouse, isolated and automated for years, still required a live-in maintenance man due to constant electrical faults. It was built in 1867, perched atop a jagged cliff. Its history was long and mostly forgotten, though Dennis had come across brief mentions of a shipwreck in the early 1900s and something about a keeper who vanished during a winter storm. Ghost stories, the kind townsfolk shared in bars. Dennis didn't believe in ghosts. He believed in rust, shorted circuits, and ocean wind that never stopped pushing against everything. When he pulled up to the caretaker's cottage next to the tower, his headlights caught the whitewashed brick and rusted railing of the balcony that circled the lighthouse's top. The fog made it look like the tower rose into nothing. The inside of the lighthouse smelled like seawater and oil. A backup generator rumbled near the back, and the stairwell was narrow and cold, the metal railing always damp to the touch. His small quarters in the cottage were functional: a bed, a kitchenette, a monitor connected to a few cameras posted along the cliffs, and a shortwave radio that mostly picked up fishermen grumbling about weather. It was near midnight when Dennis first heard the footsteps above him. He was lying in bed, half asleep, the wind rattling the windows as it always did. But these weren't random creaks. They were rhythmic, heavy, like someone pacing. He froze, staring up at the ceiling. His cottage was only one story. There was no upstairs. He got up and slipped on his boots. The wind had died down, and the fog had gotten so thick it was hard to see more than 10 feet ahead. He grabbed his flashlight and walked toward the base of the lighthouse. The door was still locked, just as he'd left it. But the metal was cold in a strange way, almost like it had been held from the inside. When he unlocked it and stepped inside, he was hit by the smell again. Salt and something else. Damp, moldy, like something that had been buried and dug back up. The light was working. The rotating lens hummed faintly above, casting long, sweeping arcs of light into the fog. Dennis started climbing the stairs, flashlight in hand, boots echoing. Each step groaned under his weight. He paused near the top, where the small glass room housed the light. The metal balcony outside was slick with moisture. No one was there. But the pacing sound continued, just a few steps away. He stepped outside and swept his flashlight across the narrow platform. Empty. The pacing stopped. He waited a long time before going back down. The next morning, he called the regional maintenance office in Augusta to report a faulty sensor in the pressure valve. Nothing about footsteps or ghostly sounds. The technician on the other end mentioned casually that some of the older keepers refused to do overnights at Beacon Point. Bad luck, weird stories. One guy said he saw someone jump from the top during a storm, but when he ran outside, there was nothing down below. Dennis didn't answer that. Instead, he made coffee and tried to dismiss the whole thing as wind and imagination. The second night, the footsteps returned. This time, he heard them in the stairwell of the lighthouse. He left the cottage again, flashlight flickering slightly, and entered the lighthouse just in time to hear the last few steps go silent. As if someone knew he was coming, he climbed all the way up again. Nothing. Not even a shift in the wind. But when he reached the top and pushed open the door to the light chamber, the smell hit him stronger than before. Salt and rot and something metallic. A single wet footprint marked the floor. Just one. Bare, wide, and pointed toward the stairs. Dennis crouched and touched it. Cold. Real. Water from the ocean? He didn't sleep that night. 2 days passed without event. He almost convinced himself he'd imagined it all. The days were bright, uneventful. He saw no boats, no people, just waves and gulls and the groan of the sea. The cameras showed only the constant churn of mist and tide. He stopped hearing footsteps, but the silence didn't last. It was the 4th night when the knocking began. Soft at first, not on his door, but on the window by his bed. 3 knocks. Precise, as though someone knew exactly where he slept. He jumped out of bed and pulled open the curtain. Nothing. But when he stepped outside, the knocking began again, this time from the front of the lighthouse. He didn't go in. He stood outside for an hour, trying to rationalize. Wind, falling branches, loose shingles. But it had been 3 slow knocks, repeated 3 times, and always on a window. He radioed the office in Augusta again the next morning. They offered to send a replacement if he wanted to cut his rotation short. He said no. Part of him was afraid. Another part felt like he had to see it through, like backing out would somehow make it worse. That night, he dreamt of the sea swallowing the lighthouse whole. On the 5th night, just after midnight, every light in the cottage died. No flicker, no dimming, just gone. The generator still rumbled, but the lights were out. Even the monitors had gone black. Dennis grabbed his flashlight and went outside. The fog was so thick he couldn't see the lighthouse, but he could see the light from its top, still sweeping, glowing faintly like an eye trying to focus. Then the radio in the cottage came back on. Static first, then a voice. It wasn't the Augusta office. It was whispering. Dennis ran back inside and slammed the door. The radio was still on. He turned the dial. No response. He unplugged it, and the whispering continued. "Come up," it said. "Clear now. Come up." He yanked the battery out. Silence. When he looked at the monitor, one camera, pointed at the base of the lighthouse, was back on. Someone was standing at the door. It was impossible to make out details in the fog, but Dennis saw the shape. Tall. Unmoving. Facing the door like it was waiting. He stared for a long time. The figure didn't move, didn't shift. He finally worked up the nerve to go out again, armed with a heavy wrench. When he reached the lighthouse, the door was open. He hadn't unlocked it. The air inside was still and wet, heavier than before. Each step up the stairs took more effort. It was as if the walls themselves were pressing inward. When he reached the top, the door to the light chamber was wide open. Standing on the edge of the balcony was a man. He wasn't modern. He wore an old oilskin coat soaked through. His hair was dark and plastered to his skull. Dennis could see water dripping from his clothes, forming a small puddle beneath his boots. The man didn't turn around. Dennis opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The man slowly raised his hand and pointed to the ocean, and then he stepped over the edge. Dennis rushed to the railing and looked down. No one. Just sea and rocks. He didn't sleep after that. He waited for the sun to rise and called Augusta. They didn't answer. He stayed awake all through the 6th day, watching the cameras, the sea, and the lighthouse. He saw no one, but the air in the cottage felt thick. The lights flickered even in daylight. The smell of the sea was inside now, even though the windows were shut. When night came again, he made a decision. He'd go back up to the top one last time. Face it, he carried a flare and his flashlight. The lighthouse door was open again. The air was freezing, the walls slick with condensation. He climbed slowly, every step groaning under his weight. When he reached the top, he opened the door to the light room. It was empty. No puddles, no man. Just the rotating beam of light sweeping across the sea. Then the light stopped turning. The motor let out a groan and died. And in the sudden stillness, Dennis heard breathing. Not his. He turned around, and there, standing inside the stairwell, was the man again. But this time he was looking directly at Dennis. His eyes were black. Not like pupils, just black, infinite, hollow, and his mouth opened slowly, soundlessly. Dennis couldn't move. The man stepped forward, water trailing behind him. The floor groaned. The lighthouse itself seemed to moan. The man reached out a hand and touched Dennis's chest. It was like falling into the ocean in midwinter. Cold, crushing, endless. Dennis blacked out. When he woke, it was morning. He was lying in the stairwell, soaked to the bone. His flashlight was broken. The light was turning again as if nothing had happened. He stumbled down, shaking, and drove out of there that same morning. He never returned. He didn't tell the full truth to the people in Augusta, said he had medical issues, needed out. They found another keeper. That man lasted 3 nights, and then they automated the whole thing. Beacon Point still stands, still sends its light into the sea, but no one lives there anymore. Not officially. But sometimes, on thick fog nights, locals say they see someone standing on the balcony, pacing and pointing. Story the end. I've never been the kind of person who believed in ghosts. That wasn't just something I said to sound tough. Truthfully, the idea never settled right in my mind. I always figured people were just trying to make sense of grief or trauma or the random cruelty of life. But what happened to me in the fall of 2017 on the coast of Maine tore through every bit of logic I clung to. I haven't talked about it in years. Not to anyone, not even my sister, who knew something had changed in me when I came back. But now that I'm not sleeping more than a few hours a night and the dreams keep crawling back, I think it's time to let it out. I just left a job in Boston trying to reset my life after a rough divorce and a couple years in a toxic newsroom. A friend of mine from college, Craig, reached out and said he knew a guy who was looking for someone to fill in as a seasonal lighthouse caretaker up in Maine. It was remote, quiet, paid surprisingly well, and didn't require much more than logging weather data and doing light maintenance. It sounded like exactly what I needed: time alone, far from people, with nothing but the ocean and the sky for company. The lighthouse sat on an island barely larger than a football field, about a half-mile off the mainland. You could only get there by boat, and only at certain times of day because of the tide. The mainland dock belonged to a retired lobsterman named Harold, who was gruff and barely spoke. He brought me over on a gray October morning, the sky bruised and the water choppy. As we bounced across the waves, I remember looking at the structure ahead and thinking it didn't belong there. It wasn't broken down or anything. It had actually been restored a few years earlier. But something about the way it hunched over the rocks, tall and narrow, with black windows and a rust-streaked base, made it feel more like a ruin than a working beacon. "You sure about this?" Harold grunted, more to himself than to me. I nodded, trying not to show my nerves. "How often does someone stay out here?" "Used to be full-time keepers back in the day," he said, eyes ahead. "Not anymore. They just pay folks like you for a couple months now and then. Most don't stay the full stretch." I didn't ask what he meant by that. The main building attached to the lighthouse was small but functional. Kitchen, bunk, tiny bathroom with barely working plumbing. The tower itself had a spiral staircase leading to the light room, and below that, 3 narrow landings used for storage, weather gear, and access to the power systems. The last person had left it mostly clean. There was a dusty cot with a thin mattress, some canned food, a shortwave radio, and a binder full of handwritten logs dating back years. The first week was uneventful. The wind never stopped. It wasn't strong all the time, but it was always there, low and whispering around the metal frame. The gulls were aggressive, and the sky never fully cleared. Nights came early, with fog rolling in thick off the water, and the light's rotation cast long, swinging shadows through the little windows. I kept myself busy, fixing a leak in the roof, making notes on wind speeds and tides, and reading from a stack of yellowed books someone had left behind. It was on the 9th night that I first heard the knocking. It started around 2 a.m., just 3 loud bangs on the door. I was dead asleep, and it jolted me upright. At first, I thought maybe Harold had come back, but when I pulled on my coat and opened the door, there was no one. Just fog so thick I couldn't see the edge of the cliff 10 feet away. I told myself it was wind, maybe a loose shutter. I checked all the windows, locked the door, and went back to sleep. The next night, it happened again. Same time, same sound. This time, it wasn't on the door. It was from inside the lighthouse tower itself, down low near the base. 3 knocks. I walked the stairs with a flashlight, every step creaking under my weight. There was nothing out of place, no sign of animals or intruders. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been moving just ahead of my light, something always a turn ahead on the spiral staircase. By the end of the second week, I stopped sleeping altogether. The knocking grew more frequent. Some nights it was a slow, dragging sound from the landing below my bunk room. Other times it was whispering, Actual voices, too faint to make out, like they were right on the other side of the wall. Once, I swore I heard someone saying my name. I started going through the old logs, trying to make sense of anything. The entries were mostly dull: weather reports, maintenance notes, supply checklists, but then I found one written in tight, messy cursive from 2006, signed by a man named Tom Devlin. October 23rd, heard them again last night. Knocking from the base, checked it twice. No one there. Wind too calm for this. Feels like they're waiting. October 25, woke up to the light spinning out of sequence. Found footprints in the stairwell. Bare feet. Tracked water up 3 landings. Shouldn't be possible. Doors locked. The next few pages were torn out. I started marking things down myself. Every sound. Every shadow. The day the light turned itself off during a clear morning. The night I found the logbook moved from my desk to the tower's highest room, pages flipped open. I didn't remember going up there. And then came the girl. It was near the end of October, after a day of heavy rain. I hadn't spoken to another person in almost 3 weeks. I was sitting on the narrow porch that circled the lighthouse base, drinking cold coffee and staring out at the gray. The fog had lifted for once, and I could see the shore clearly. That's when I saw her. She stood on the rocks near the waterline, long black hair matted to her face, a pale blue dress clinging to her thin frame. She was barefoot, her skin bluish like she'd been in cold water too long. She didn't wave, didn't call out, just stood there looking up at me. I shouted, asked if she was okay. I ran down the stairs and outside, but by the time I reached the bottom, she was gone. I circled the entire island twice. Nothing, no footprints, no sign anyone had been there. That night, she came back. I woke to the sound of the light freezing in mid-rotation, something that wasn't supposed to happen. The motor whined and clicked, stuck in place. I climbed the tower to reset it, but when I opened the hatch, she was standing inside the glass chamber. She didn't move, didn't blink, just stared at me through dripping hair. Her lips were moving, but no sound came out. I slammed the hatch and nearly fell down the stairs in my panic. When I returned with a flashlight and a wrench, she was gone. I tried to call Harold the next morning, but the radio was just static. My phone had died days earlier, and the solar battery was acting up. I couldn't leave without the boat, and the tide wouldn't allow a crossing until 2 days later. I locked every door, slept with a hammer beside the bed. That final night, everything came apart. It started just after midnight. A storm had rolled in, fierce and sudden, slamming rain sideways against the windows. The lighthouse shuddered with every gust. Then the knocking came, relentless from every wall, every floorboard. I heard footsteps, bare, wet, running up and down the stairs. The lights flickered. The air inside the tower felt heavy, like the pressure had dropped out of the world. And then the door opened. Not the outside door, the hatch at the top of the tower. I didn't go up. I couldn't. I just stood at the base of the stairs and stared as the light above slowly began to rotate again, casting wide, stuttering beams across the inside walls. One of those beams passed over the stairwell, and for just a second, I saw them. Not just the girl. Others. Dozens of them. Men, women, even children. All soaked, skin pallid and stretched, staring down at me from each curve of the spiral stairs. They didn't move, didn't speak. Just watched. When the beam passed again, they were gone. At dawn, the storm cleared. The radio chirped back to life. I sent a message, and Harold came by mid-morning. I didn't say anything as we crossed back to shore. I don't think I even looked at him. He didn't ask. I never went back. I heard the lighthouse was decommissioned the following year. Too expensive to maintain, they said, too remote. But I know why they shut it down. Some nights I still hear the wind and the knocking, and once, in a dream, I was back in the tower, the light frozen, the stairs crowded with silent figures. One of them was me. Story, the end. The sea was a restless companion from the moment I arrived at the Old Point Lighthouse on the rocky coast of Maine. It was the autumn of 2004 when I took the job as the temporary caretaker. I wasn't exactly looking for a ghost story, but that's what I found. The lighthouse was more than 150 years old, standing tall on the craggy cliffs overlooking the Atlantic. The paint was peeling, the windows were thick with salt spray, and the old Fresnel lens still sat in the lantern room, though the light hadn't been lit in decades. The town wanted to renovate it into a museum, and until the work began, they needed someone to stay overnight to keep it secure. I was a young man then, freshly out of college, looking for something to pay the bills and give me time to think. The isolation of the lighthouse was appealing, even if the locals gave me a few sideways glances when I mentioned I'd be staying there alone. The first days were quiet. The wind tore at the rocks and shook the windows. The waves crashed against the shore with relentless fury, and the smell of salt and seaweed filled the air. At night, I sat by the stove, reading old maritime journals the Historical Society had left behind. It was on the third night that I first noticed the sounds. At first, it was faint, footsteps echoing in the spiral staircase, a creak in the floorboards, whispers carried on the wind. I told myself if it was the building settling, the old wood reacting to the cold, or the wind shifting through cracks. But the feeling of being watched grew stronger. One night, as I lay in the small bedroom, I heard the distinct sound of a lantern being lit, the faint click, and then a soft glow emanating from the tower above. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed the spiral stairs to investigate. The lantern room was empty, the glass dusty, and the brass fittings dull. No sign of a flame or recent activity. I returned to my quarters shaken, but chalked it up to exhaustion and imagination. The locals had told me about Captain James McAllister, the last keeper before automation took over in the 1930s. The story went that during a brutal winter storm, the captain had vanished without a trace. Some said he had been swept away by the sea. Others whispered of something darker, like he had become part of the lighthouse itself, forever bound to its light. That same night, as I tried to sleep, I heard faint singing, soft, melancholy, almost a lullaby. It seemed to come from the walls themselves, rising and falling with the rhythm of the waves. The next day, I explored the keeper's logbook stored in the small library room. Among the faded pages, I found entries from Captain McAllister himself. His final notes mentioned strange lights on the horizon, voices calling in the storm, and a growing sense of dread. The more I read, the more the past seemed to seep into the present. On the seventh night, the weather turned savage. The wind screamed, the waves roared like wild beasts, and the sky was a black void pierced by lightning. I was jolted awake by a pounding on the door, a frantic, desperate knocking. I hesitated, then opened the door to find no one there, only the rain and the swirling fog. Suddenly a shadow darted past the window, a tall figure, drenched, eyes glowing faintly in the dark. I froze. The footsteps came again, heavy, wet, climbing the spiral staircase. I reached the lantern room where the air was icy cold. There, standing by the lens, was the ghostly apparition of Captain McAllister. His face was pale, eyes sunken but fierce, and his coat whipped by an unseen wind. He raised a trembling hand, pointing toward the raging sea below. I understood then. He was warning me. Hours later, the Coast Guard found the wreckage of a fishing boat smashed against the rocks just off the shore. The crew was missing, lost to the merciless ocean. I left Old Point Lighthouse the following morning, my heart heavy with the knowledge that some souls are tethered to their duties long after death. Sometimes, on quiet nights back in the city, I swear I still hear the soft singing of the lighthouse keeper calling out across the waves. Story the end.